for a moment and allowed herself to feel the safety of family once more. __________. The ladies Roslyn and Arya Stark. The announcer's voice boomed through the vast hall as the two girls stepped inside. The weight of the eyes upon them was immediate, nobles from all corners of the realm, their silks and velvets rustling as they turned to observe the new arrivals. Roslyn scanned the room, recognizing a few familiar faces among the sea of richly dressed lords and ladies, while others remained strangers, their curious gazes sharp. Roslyn could feel the tension in the air, thick as the heat that clung to King's Landing. They were called to this gathering before making their way to Baelor's September, where Ned Stark would stand before the city and make his declaration. Her stomach twisted at the thought. With a gentle hand, she guided Arya forward, her touch light yet steady. It didn't take long for her eyes to settle on Robb, standing near the far end of the hall. He was deep in conversation with Petyr Baelish, his posture tense, but he straightened as he noticed their approach. Sansa stood beside them, her face pale and strained. "Come," Roslyn murmured to Arya, her hand still resting on the girl's back. Together, they made their way across the grand hall, weaving through the crowd as whispers followed in their wake. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, but Roslyn kept her chin high, her gaze steady as they moved toward the only people in the room who truly mattered. When they finally reached them, Robb turned to them, his expression softening as his eyes met Roslyn's. "Roslyn," Arya Robb greeted, his voice low but warm as his gaze shifted between his wife and his sister. He gave Arya a brief, approving nod, his worry tempered by relief at seeing her cleaned up and presentable, but still very much the stubborn child she'd always been. He leaned down to place a delicate kiss on Roslyn's cheek. As he straightened, his hand gently brushed against Roslyn's stomach, a quiet acknowledgement of the life growing there, his silent promise to protect them both. Sansa, standing a little to the side, stepped forward. Her eyes flicked nervously to Arya before meeting Roslyn's. "Arya," she said in a strained but gentle tone. She reached out and took her sister's hand, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. "It's good to see you." Arya stared at her for a moment, clearly still feeling some of the resentment from their time apart, but then she gave a curt nod in return. The hostility that had once existed between the sisters seemed to have dimmed in the face of everything they had endured. Before the silence could stretch too long, Petyr Baelish stepped forward with a smooth bow, his sharp eyes gleaming with their usual calculating charm. "Lady Roslyn, Lady Arya," he greeted, his voice dripping with polite formality, though his gaze lingered a beat too long on Roslyn before shifting to Robb. "It is truly heartwarming to see the Starks reunited, even under such difficult circumstances," he continued, his tone laced with subtle insinuation. "A shame, though, that Lady Catelyn couldn't be here for the occasion." Robb said nothing, his jaw tightening as he recognized Petyr's veiled attempt to provoke him. Baelish, ever the opportunist, pressed on with feigned sympathy. "She has written to me on multiple occasions, expressing her deep desire to join you all here, but alas, Lord Bolton insists she remains where she is." A thunderous bang, bang echoed through the hall, drawing every eye toward the Iron Throne. The crowd fell into a hushed silence, their attention snapping to the source of the noise, a finely dressed courtier who stood at the head of the room, wielding a large wooden staff. All eyes followed his movements as he raised his voice to announce the king's arrival. "His Grace, Joffrey of the houses Baratheon and Lannister, first of his name, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm, King of the Andals, the First Men, and the Rhoynar." As Joffrey strode into the room, resplendent in golden finery that gleamed like his own hair, his presence demanded every bit of attention. Behind him, his mother, Cersei, followed in her signature crimson gown. The women in the hall dropped into deep curtsies, while the men bowed their heads as Joffrey approached the Iron Throne, his expression a mask of self-satisfaction. He took his place before the towering seat of power, eyes sweeping the room with an imperious air. "My lords and ladies," Joffrey began, his voice carrying through the hall with a sinister edge, "I thank you for your presence on this bittersweet day. Today, we will hear from a traitor to the crown, my father's closest friend, a man who chose betrayal before my father's body was even cold." Roslyn felt Robb tense beside her. She knew this day would be far from easy. Joffrey needed to maintain the appearance of chasing justice, even though the outcome was already predetermined. He had to play the part of a king deliberating with care, so that when he finally bestowed his twisted version of mercy, it would feel authentic. Without hesitation, Roslin squeezed Rob's hand, offering silent support as Joffrey's venomous words continued to drip from his tongue. "Today, I am faced with the hardest decision of my reign," Joffrey declared, his tone almost mocking in its sincerity. "How to punish a man who is both a traitor to the crown and one of those responsible for putting it on my father's head." He paused, casting a sweeping look across the room. "But I take comfort in knowing that the next generation of House Stark," he gestured toward Robb and his family, "supports me fully in whatever outcome I choose today." At his signal, the eyes of the gathered lords and ladies turned toward the Starks. The weight of their stares pressed down on Roslin, and for a moment, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. She felt the scrutiny, the curiosity, and even the judgment in their gazes. Finally, Joffrey shattered the tension with a dismissive wave. "Let us depart for the September," he said, descending the throne steps with the deliberate grace of a king. His mother and the guards followed closely, his golden cloak flowing behind him as he swept out of the room. Just before disappearing through the door, he offered Roslin a brief, smug smile, a silent reminder of the power he held over them all. Roslin glanced at her husband, sensing the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. She stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm, offering what silent support she could. "We'll stand together," she said softly, her voice for his ears alone. He looked down at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, before he turned to Arya and Sansa. "Stay close. Whatever happens, we will face it as a family." Arya looked up at him, her expression hardening with determination. Sansa, still pale, nodded silently, her hand clutching Arya's a little tighter. __________. They arrived at the September to find Joffrey already positioned at the top of the steps, waving down at the sea of citizens who had gathered to witness the former hand of the king meet his fate. The square buzzed with anticipation, and Roslin could feel the tension thick in the air. She and Robb made their way to the section reserved for nobles, where they were given a clear view of the spectacle about to unfold. The space felt stifling, cordoned off from the crowd below as if to remind them of their separation from the common folk. Sansa stood beside them, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground, eyes vacant and distant. Arya, in stark contrast, couldn't seem to tear her eyes away from the crowd, her expression hard and unreadable. Roslin watched her, a pang of realization settling in. Days ago, Arya had been part of that crowd, lost among the faces of the city's masses. In another world, she might still be there, hidden and surviving. Robb nodded stiffly, his composure unbroken despite the growing tension that seemed to thicken the very air around them. He glanced briefly at Roslin, his eyes dark with a mix of dread and determination. Without a word, he began to move, gesturing for Sansa and Arya to follow, though Sansa hesitated for a heartbeat before complying, her face pale and expression unreadable. Roslin took a deep breath, smoothing her dress as she stepped in line behind Robb, the weight of the king's demand settling heavily on her. Arya, for her part, looked less frightened than she should have, her gaze sharp and defiant as she marched alongside her family. As they ascended the steps to the September, the eyes of the crowd followed their every movement, whispers rippling through the nobles as they passed. The sun beat down mercilessly, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of impending doom that Roslin felt in her bones. At the top, Joffrey stood with Cersei and his siblings at his side, their golden and crimson garb glistening like the very symbols of power they wielded. Joffrey's face bore a smirk, though his eyes held no warmth, just that familiar cruelty simmering beneath the surface. Cersei, by contrast, was unreadable, her features carved from stone as she stood like a queen carved from the very rock that Casterly Rock stood on. "Ah, Lord Stark," Joffrey greeted, his tone light but mocking. "It pleases me to see you all here for this solemn occasion." Roslin's fingers twitched, her instinct to grab Robb's hand overwhelming, but she resisted. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat a reminder of the fragile balance they were treading. Robb inclined his head slightly, his face a mask of formality. "We are here as requested, Your Grace." Joffrey's smirk widened at the formality, clearly enjoying the power he held in this moment. "Excellent," he drawled. "You and your family will have the best view in the house." Roslin's throat tightened. The king's words were a thinly veiled mockery, his pleasure in their suffering evident. She glanced sideways at Sansa, whose hands were trembling slightly, and at Arya, whose fists were clenched as if she were preparing for a fight. The crowd grew restless as the king's justice stepped forward, positioning himself ominously near the September doors. Rosalind's heart sank deeper into the pit of her stomach. Joffrey wasn't going to let this go easily. This was his game, his performance, and they were all merely pieces in it. He had promised to let Ned go, to let him go home, but he was unpredictable and Rosalind knew that nothing was certain. She stole a glance at Robb, who remained rigid and silent, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding below. His face betrayed nothing, but Rosalind could sense the storm raging inside him. He had come this far, endured humiliation and the uncertainty of King's Landing, all for this moment. For his father's freedom. But nothing felt certain. Not with Joffrey. The crowd had grown larger, citizens pressing into the square, eager to see the fate of the traitor Lord Stark. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the whispers and murmurs swelling like a tide. Every face below seemed to hold a hunger for the spectacle, a mix of anticipation and fear. The heavy doors of Baelor's September groaned open, and there was a sudden, collective intake of breath from the crowd. Out from the shadows emerged Eddard Stark, flanked by guards, his hands bound in front of him. He walked slowly, the weight of his imprisonment clear in the stiffness of his movements. Rosalind had never met the Lord of Winterfell before, but even she could tell that he was changed. His beard was long, his face gaunt, but his eyes, those Stark eyes, still held that fierce resolve, even in the face of what was to come. Sansa let out a small, choked gasp, and Robb's hand twitched at his side. Arya stood deathly still, her young face a mask of disbelief and anger. Rosalind could feel the tension in all of them, the threadbare hope that still clung to the idea of their father's release. Eddard was led to the front of the steps, where he was forced to kneel before the crowd. Rosalind's stomach turned at the sight of him, once a noble lord, now a prisoner, stripped of his titles and dignity. She couldn't help but glance toward Joffrey, who was watching with a predatory gleam in his eyes. Lord Eddard Stark. Joffrey's voice rang out, high and sharp as it cut through the crowd's murmurings. You stand accused of treason against the crown. Do you have anything to say? Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment. The moment where Joffrey would either uphold his promise, or break it entirely. The silence was suffocating, the crowd waiting with bated breath. I am guilty, Your Grace, Eddard said, his voice steady but hollow. In my grief after your father's death, I allowed myself to be misled, manipulated by your uncles. Rosalind could hear the lie in his tone, the forced words betraying his true thoughts, but no one dared to challenge him. Not now. I see now that I was wrong, Eddard continued, his gaze steady but burdened with the weight of his confession. You are your father's true heir, the rightful king of Westeros. The Lords Stannis and Renly are traitors, and they must face the king's justice. As must I. His words hung heavy in the air, a confession of betrayal that felt painfully false, yet necessary for the game he was forced to play. Rosalind watched as Ned Stark's words settled over the crowd like a thick fog, palpable in their disbelief. The man before them, once the embodiment of honor, was now renouncing his loyalty, and for what? To protect his family, his daughters, his house. Her heart ached for him, for the weight of this moment. She squeezed Robb's hand, but he remained stone still, his jaw clenched tightly as his father's false confession echoed through the square. Joffrey, standing tall at the steps of the September, smiled, a thin, cruel twist of his lips. His golden crown glinted in the harsh sunlight, making him seem more like a golden statue than a boy king. He looked over the crowd, enjoying the tension he had orchestrated, reveling in the power he held over life and death. You see. Joffrey's voice rang out, cold and triumphant. Even Lord Stark admits his treason. The words were a blade, cutting through any hope that might have lingered in Rosalind's heart. There was a murmur among the gathered crowd, a mix of disbelief, shock, and dread. The nobles exchanged uneasy glances, while the common folk muttered in fear. Cersei shifted beside Joffrey, her face unreadable, though her eyes flickered briefly with something akin to concern. Rosalind wondered if even she feared what her son might do next. Joffrey stepped forward, his smirk widening as he addressed the crowd. My mother and my council have advised mercy, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. And Lord Stark has pleaded for his life, for the sake of his daughters. He turned his gaze to Robb and Rosalind, letting the weight of his words fall on them. Rosalind's gaze locked onto Joffrey, her eyes hard and unblinking, her expression controlled. She knew what Joffrey wanted, He wanted her to play her character, another man's wife who truly wanted him, the woman he wanted but couldn't have. And she was happy to oblige. She tilted her chin ever so slightly, as if daring him to make his next move, challenging him in a way that would stoke his need to prove himself. Her heart raced, but outwardly, she remained composed, the perfect image of resilience. Joffrey, sensing the tension, seemed to revel in it. He raised his voice, addressing the crowd with dramatic flair. "I will not begin my reign by spilling the blood of my father's dearest friend," he declared, his tone heavy with faux magnanimity. A man who was his brother in all but name, especially in a time where his brothers by blood have proved to be the most traitorous. He paused, letting the crowd absorb his words. Roslin could see the calculated performance in every gesture, every word. This wasn't mercy, it was a game. However, Joffrey continued, his voice shifting to a sharper tone, "Lord Stark cannot go unpunished. His poor judgment has proven him unfit to lead the North. Therefore, he will be stripped of all titles and lands, which shall pass to his heir, Robb of House Stark." Roslin's heart tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. Beside her, Robb stood frozen, his face a mask of barely contained rage, though his eyes flickered with relief at the news that his father's life would be spared. Joffrey pressed on, his voice filled with self-importance. "Lord Stark will live out the rest of his days in Winterfell, as a husband to his wife and a father to his children, but he will no longer hold power or sway in this or any land." The crowd shifted, murmurs spreading through the gathered nobles and commoners alike. Joffrey's eyes gleamed as he cast a glance toward Sansa, his voice softening with a false tenderness. "I do this in memory of my late father and for the love of my future queen, Sansa Stark." Sansa's head jerked up, startled, her wide eyes meeting Joffrey's outstretched hand. He beckoned her to join him, his smile smug and possessive. Together, Joffrey announced, "We will forge a new Westeros, where mercy and forgiveness stand side by side with justice and punishment." The crowd, ever fickle, erupted in cheers. "King Joffrey," they shouted. "Long live the king." A few scattered voices even called, "Queen Sansa." The wave of support felt sickeningly false to Roslin. She couldn't help but think that if Joffrey had called for Ned's head, the crowd would have cheered just as loudly for that too. Two Kingsguard stepped forward, lifting Ned from his knees and unlocking his shackles. He stood, unsteady but upright, his expression unreadable. As the crowd's cheers echoed through the square, Roslin kept her focus on Joffrey. His performance, though calculated, had the desired effect. The crowd was whipped into a frenzy of approval. But Roslin knew better than to trust the sudden shift in tone. Everything was a show for Joffrey, a dangerous game with the lives of others as his pawns. Beside her, Robb's body remained tense, though the faintest flicker of relief crossed his features as Ned was freed from his shackles. His father stood, shoulders stooped from the weight of humiliation, but alive. Roslin wanted to reach for Robb's hand, to reassure him, but the moment wasn't safe enough for such a gesture. They were still being watched, still very much part of Joffrey's spectacle. Sansa, pale as a ghost, moved slowly toward Joffrey, her steps hesitant as she took his outstretched hand. The young king smiled down at her, his expression smug and satisfied, as if he'd just secured the greatest prize. Roslin could see Sansa's fear in the tightness of her shoulders, the trembling in her fingers as they linked with Joffrey's. Joffrey held her hand up for the crowd to see, basking in the adoration as if Sansa were a jewel he had plucked from the north and placed in his crown. "Our reign begins today," he declared, his voice ringing with triumph. Roslin's stomach churned at the sight. Sansa had no choice but to play along, no choice but to endure whatever future Joffrey had planned for her. Roslin wanted to run to her, to pull her away from this nightmare, but she knew it was impossible. They were all caught in this web, powerless against Joffrey's whims. As Ned was freed, he began to walk towards where the Robb, Roslin and Arya waited. His steps were slow, his face drawn with exhaustion and the pain of everything he'd been forced to endure. As he reached them, Robb stepped forward, his voice low and strained. "Father." Ned met his son's gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and pride. "Robb," he murmured, his voice rough from days of captivity. "I am so sorry, my son." Robb clenched his jaw, his voice a quiet but firm whisper. "We'll get through this, father. We'll go home." His gaze softened as he turned toward Roslin. "Father, this is my wife, Lady Roslin." He gestured for her to step forward. Ned's eyes widened in surprise as Roslyn approached and offered a respectful nod. "It's an honor, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the tension hanging over them. Ned gave her a tired smile, shaking his head gently. "I'm no lord anymore, my dear. But I look forward to hearing how my son found such a beautiful wife." There was warmth in his tone, though it was tinged with the weariness of all he had endured. Before the moment could linger, Varys appeared beside them, his face calm but his words carrying a quiet urgency. "Lord Stark, Lady Stark," he said with a subtle nod to Roslyn and the others. "I suggest you make your way back to your quarters. The city's mood can shift unpredictably, especially on a day like this." Robb didn't need further convincing. He nodded, placing a firm, protective hand on Arya's shoulder, pulling her closer to him. "We should go," he said, his voice tight with determination. Roslyn moved closer to Ned, offering silent support, knowing the weight he carried now. She cast a glance toward Sansa, wanting desperately to reach out to her, but Joffrey was already leading her away, his hand gripping hers as they made their way toward the royal litter. The message was clear: they may have gotten Ned back, but Sansa was his. Roslyn's heart ached as she watched her sister-in-law being led further into Joffrey's grasp, but there was nothing she could do. Not yet. For now, they had to take what they could, their family, in whatever form it remained, and find a way to endure. Chapter 13, Roslyn 6. Chapter text. Roslyn 6. Later that evening, Roslyn stood in her chambers, preparing herself for the ceremony that would commence in a few moments. The atmosphere in the room was a stark contrast to the gravity of their situation. Robb would soon be named Warden of the North, with Roslyn by his side as his lady. As she glanced around the room, she saw the scene of lively activity. Robb was seated with Sansa, who was proudly displaying the intricate embroidery she had completed on her dress. Ned, looking slightly more rejuvenated in freshly shaved and formal attire, watched with a hint of satisfaction. Meanwhile, Arya, her spirits lifted, demonstrated her skills with a wooden sword, showing off the techniques she had learned from her dancing master. The room buzzed with an almost deceptive cheerfulness, an island of happiness in the sea of uncertainty that loomed just beyond. Tomorrow, everything would shift once again, and the weight of the future was a shadow over their joy. Plans for the immediate future were already set. Arya, Ned, and Robb would leave for Harrenhal at first light. From there, Arya, Ned, and Catelyn would continue their journey home to Winterfell, while Robb would join Tywin and Jaime Lannister's campaign. Roslyn, on the other hand, would remain in King's Landing, tasked with mentoring Sansa in preparation for her future role as Queen of the Realm. It was a role fraught with its own challenges, but it was one Roslyn had to embrace. Her thoughts wandered to the hope she clung to, that Robb would be able to end the war swiftly enough for them to reunite in Winterfell before their child was born. She longed for their baby to arrive in love, surrounded by family in the safety of Robb's home, rather than the heat and hostility of King's Landing. But she knew, deep down, that this hope was fragile. The earlier garments they had worn seemed plain and unremarkable now, overshadowed by the opulence of their new attire. Sansa and Arya had both donned elegant grey gowns, each embellished with intricately designed wolf motifs that Sansa herself had painstakingly added. Arya, however, appeared visibly uncomfortable in her dress, which pinched awkwardly in all the wrong places as she attempted to wield her wooden sword. Ned's attire was the simplest of all, a crisp white shirt paired with a leather jacket and a belt, understated yet dignified. Robb's outfit was more striking, a grey jacket that shimmered with silver in the light, a perfect match for Roslyn's gown. Roslyn's dress was a masterpiece of layered fabric, its heavy material hugging her waist and chest, creating a silhouette that draped gracefully to the floor. The gown flowed like a waterfall, with a short train trailing behind her, making her feel both elegant and distinctly transformed. As she looked at her reflection, she felt as if the person looking back was unfamiliar to her. A brief rattle at the door interrupted the room's murmur, bringing a sudden silence. A guard pushed the door open and announced, "It's time." Ned quickly ushered the younger girls out, exchanging a brief, hushed word with Robb that Roslyn couldn't overhear. After the girls had left, Robb offered Roslyn a reassuring smile before donning the large, heavy ceremonial cloak that had once overwhelmed her on their wedding day. The cloak now fit him perfectly, though Roslyn could only imagine how stifling it must be under the relentless King's Landing sun. Robb stood resolute by the door, the weight of the cloak accentuating his commanding presence. He extended his arm towards Roslin, who accepted it without hesitation. "Are you with me?" he asked, his gaze fixed ahead. "Always," Roslin replied softly, her voice steady and unwavering. Roslin and Rob moved through the corridors of the Red Keep, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished stone floors. The weight of the ceremony hung heavily in the air, mingling with the tension that had settled over the palace. As they walked, Roslin stole glances at Rob, noting the tight set of his jaw and the way his gaze remained fixed ahead, focused and resolute. They reached the grand hall where the ceremony was to take place, the massive doors looming before them. The hall was already filled with nobles and dignitaries, their murmurs creating a low hum of anticipation. The atmosphere was electric with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, every guest keenly aware of the significance of the moment. As Roslin and Rob approached the grand hall, the towering doors loomed before them, a solemn gateway to the ceremony that awaited. The hall was already a sea of finely dressed nobles and dignitaries, their low murmurs weaving a tapestry of anticipation. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a mixture of excitement and apprehension that hinted at the weight of the occasion. Roslin's eyes roamed the room, taking in the array of unfamiliar sigils that adorned the lords and ladies. This was no ordinary transition of power. The ceremony had been hastily arranged, a departure from the usual protocol that would see major houses summoned to witness the new warden swear their allegiance. In addition to the haste, many houses were split, now fractured into rival claimants, and the recent alignment of House Tyrell with Renly Baratheon through a swift marriage of their daughter, Margaery. The war was becoming real and people needed to choose a side. Rob paused at the threshold, turning slightly to meet Roslin's eyes. The intensity of his gaze spoke volumes. This was a pivotal moment for them both. Roslin squeezed his arm reassuringly before they stepped into the hall together, the crowd's eyes immediately drawn to the new arrivals. The grand hall was adorned with banners of House Stark and House Lannister, their rich colors contrasting sharply with the cold, grey stone. The high, vaulted ceiling was decorated with intricate tapestries, and the light from the chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the gathering. As Rob and Roslin made their way down the center aisle, the room fell into a respectful silence. The nobles, dressed in their finest, watched with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Joffrey stood at the head of the room, sat on his throne, his expression a mask of regal satisfaction. Beside him, Sansa looked anxious, her gaze occasionally meeting Roslin's with a hint of pity that didn't linger for long due to Cersei's presence at her other side. Rob and Roslin approached the foot of the steps to the throne where the ceremony would take place. The anticipation was palpable, each guest eager for the proceedings to begin. As they reached the steps, Rob took his place and knelt in front of Joffrey, while Roslin stood slightly behind him, her presence a silent support. Joffrey cleared his throat, and the room fell into an expectant hush. "Lords and ladies," he began, his voice echoing through the hall. "Today we gather to honor the new Warden of the North, Robb Stark, and his lady, Roslin Stark. Their dedication to the realm and to each other exemplifies the strength and unity we seek in these turbulent times." The crowd responded with silence. Rob's face remained stoic, but Roslin could sense the weight of the moment settling over him. She could feel the weight of her own role in this unfolding drama, knowing that their lives were about to shift dramatically once again. Grand Maester Pycelle, holding aloft a massive and weathered tome, stepped forward to address Rob. The book, its cover cracked with age, seemed to symbolize the weight of tradition about to be honored. "Do you, Rob of House Stark, swear by the old gods and the new to pledge your allegiance to King Joffrey of the houses Baratheon and Lannister?" Pycelle asked, his voice resonating with solemnity. Rob responded with deliberate clarity, "I, Rob of House Stark, swear by the old gods and the new to obey King Joffrey, to protect his lands and honor, and to keep the North safe and secure in his name for the rest of my life." Pycelle nodded approvingly, then dipped his fingers into a small vessel of holy water. He placed a single drop upon Rob's forehead and recited, "May the light of the Seven guide you and lead you from evil." He followed this with the placement of a small, symbolic cracker into Rob's mouth, a gesture signifying the binding of his oath. King Joffrey, his face a mask of practiced benevolence, then addressed Rob. "I, Joffrey of the houses Baratheon and Lannister, accept you as my vassal. As long as I live, you shall have warmth at my hearth, steel from my forge, and a place at my table." With a final flourish of false graciousness, Joffrey rose from his throne and descended the steps. He laid a heavy hand on Rob's shoulder, his grip both firm and commanding. Rob kept his head bowed in respect as Joffrey's voice cut through the tension. "Rise, Lord Stark." The crowd responded with a brief but polite applause as Rob rose from his kneeling position and rejoined Roslin. Joffrey resumed his seat on the throne, his posture radiating a sense of entitlement and control. Grand Maester Pycelle then turned his attention to Roslin. "Lady Stark," Pycelle intoned, his voice carrying a note of formality. Roslin had been informed only days before that, as the wife of the newly appointed warden, she was required to swear her own oath. Unlike those who married after their spouse's appointment, whose oaths could be given privately, Roslin was compelled to make her pledge publicly. This expectation filled her with dread, a sentiment she struggled to hide. "Do you, Roslin of the houses Stark and Free, swear by the old gods and the new to pledge your allegiance to King Joffrey of the houses Baratheon and Lannister?" Pycelle asked, his gaze steady and unyielding. Roslin could feel Joffrey's eyes boring into her, a palpable pressure that made her stomach churn. Despite this, she maintained her focus on Pycelle, determined to fulfill her role. "I, Roslin of the houses Stark and Free, swear by the old gods and the new to obey King Joffrey, to support my lord husband in his duties to the king, and to uphold the safety of the North in his name for the remainder of my life," she declared, her voice steady though her heart raced. Pycelle dipped his fingers into the vessel of holy water once more, applying a single drop to Roslin's forehead as he recited, "May the light of the Seven guide you and lead you from evil." Roslin raised her head and opened her mouth as she had been instructed, her eyes meeting Joffrey's. He responded with a smirk, his expression a mix of satisfaction and calculated cruelty, as Pycelle placed the small cracker onto her tongue. The feeling was deeply unsettling, it felt wrong, it felt sexual. It was becoming increasingly evident that Joffrey's interest in her was far from innocent. What she had initially dismissed as a mere test or a ploy to unsettle Rob had revealed itself to be something darker. The way Joffrey looked at her as she sat at his feet on her knees. She knew how a man looked at a woman he wanted. Even a man as twisted as Joffrey could look that way. Joffrey descended from the throne with a calculated, almost mocking grace, far more deliberate than his previous movements with Rob. His voice, dripping with false benevolence, filled the hall. "I, Joffrey of the houses Baratheon and Lannister, accept you as my vassal. As long as I live, you shall have warmth at my hearth, food from my harvest, and a place at my table." A whisper reached Roslin's ears from behind, a young knight's voice barely concealed by his friend's muffled laughter. "And a place in my bed," the comment was audibly cutting, and she could see from the faces around her that it had been heard by more than a few, including Rob. Joffrey's hand landed on her shoulder, echoing the gesture he had used with Rob, but this time, he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I want to see you, tonight," he murmured with a chilling intimacy. Roslin struggled to maintain her composure, fighting against the urge to react. As Joffrey straightened and addressed her again, his voice commanded attention. "Rise, Lady Stark." He extended his hand to her, a gesture that was both a command and a prelude to something far more disturbing. With a reluctant breath, she took his hand and stood, her resolve tested but unwavering. Roslin stepped back to Rob's side as Joffrey ascended the steps to his throne one last time. The king's voice rang out with forced cheerfulness. "Please join me in celebrating the newly appointed Lord and Lady of Winterfell." The crowd responded with polite applause, a stark contrast to the earlier, more enthusiastic reactions of the common people. Joffrey continued, his tone dripping with feigned sincerity, "Tomorrow, Lord Stark will join my grandson and my uncle on their campaign to vanquish the wood usurpers, Stannis and Renly. The kingdom will be restored to safety under the reign of the one true king." In response, one of the young knights from the crowd let out a loud cheer, "Long live the king!" His voice was quickly joined by others, creating a wave of forced enthusiasm that echoed through the hall. Roslin glanced sideways at Rob, noting the tight set of his jaw. He was trying to maintain his composure, but the weight of the ceremony and Joffrey's calculated cruelty was evident. Joffrey, basking in the attention, surveyed the crowd with a smirk before his gaze settled back on Roslin and Rob. The king's satisfaction was palpable, a mask for the unsettling control he exerted over them all. Rob offered a stiff smile, returning the crowd's applause with a nod. Roslin mirrored his gesture, though her heart felt heavy with unease. The celebration was a veneer over the tension and uncertainty that lay beneath. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the nobles and dignitaries moving in groups, the atmosphere shifted from the grand spectacle to more private, muted conversations. Roslin felt a knot of dread settle in her stomach, knowing that while the ceremony had ended, their real challenges were only beginning. As they made their way through the hall, Roslin caught a final glimpse of Joffrey, who was already engaged in conversation with his court. His eyes, however, kept drifting back to her, a reminder of the unsettling promise he had made. Chapter 14, Roslin 7. Chapter text. Roslin 7. Robb stormed into their chambers, his face a thundercloud of barely contained rage. He hadn't spoken a word to Roslin during the entire walk back from the hall, his long strides leaving her struggling to keep up in her heavy gown. As soon as they crossed the threshold, he tore away from her, his expression dark and unreadable, not even sparing her a glance. The tension in the room was thick, the air itself charged with the weight of his fury. Without warning, Robb's hand shot out, grabbing a delicate glass vase that had sat undisturbed on a small wooden table. Before Roslin could react, he hurled it across the room with all the force of his frustration. The vase shattered against the stone floor, the sharp crack of its impact reverberating through the chamber as glass fragments scattered across the ground like jagged pieces of ice. "Robb!" Roslin gasped, her heart racing in her chest as she rushed to close the doors behind them, her movements frantic. She shut the door with a soft thud, her fingers trembling on the latch, knowing she needed to shield them from prying eyes. No one could witness Robb Stark, the new Warden of the North, losing control like this. Not here, not now. Her voice softened, wary of his mood. "What are you doing?" She stepped closer, cautious but determined, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of the man she knew beneath the storm. "He won't stop, Ro." Robb growled, spinning around to face her, his voice thick with desperation. His face was flushed, the veins in his neck standing out in sharp relief, and his brow was deeply furrowed with a mix of rage and helplessness. "He won't stop until he has you." His words came out like a bitter curse, his chest heaving. "And I have to leave you here, with him." His hands clenched into fists as his eyes darted around the room, searching for something else to break, something that might offer even a moment's release from the suffocating weight of his fear and frustration. Before he could act, Roslin rushed to him, grabbing his hands firmly, refusing to let him lash out any further. "And I will not let him," she said, her voice strong, matching his intensity but not his fury. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with resolve. "I am yours, Robb. From the day we married until my last breath. No lord, no king, not even the gods themselves will take me from you." Her words were soft but laced with an iron will, a promise spoken from the very core of her being. Robb's chest rose and fell in heavy breaths, his storm of anger simmering into something else, something closer to despair. He looked down at her, his hands trembling beneath her grasp, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. His eyes softened, but the tension didn't leave his body entirely. "I know you mean it," he whispered, his voice strained, almost broken. "But Joffrey, he takes what he wants, breaks what he doesn't care to keep. And Robb's voice faltered, his throat tightening with the thought. "He'll find ways to hurt you, to hurt us both, just because he can. And I won't be here to protect you." Roslin tightened her grip on his hands, stepping closer, her forehead nearly touching his. "You've never needed to protect me," she said, her voice calm, like an anchor in the storm. "I know who I'm dealing with. I've seen Joffrey's cruelty, his games, and I am not helpless. I am the wolf's wife and I won't bend for him. I'll be careful, I'll play his game if I must, but I won't let him break me. And he won't come between us." Robb's breath hitched, his gaze searching hers as though looking for some kind of reassurance. He knew she was strong, but his fear for her, fear of what Joffrey was capable of, was like a gnawing beast inside him. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air heavy with unspoken fears and shared strength. Finally, Robb let out a deep, shuddering breath, his shoulders slumping as the last of his rage melted away. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if letting her go would mean losing her to the darkness that surrounded them. "I can't stand the thought of him near you," he murmured into her hair. "It kills me." "I know," she whispered back, resting her head against his chest. "But you'll come back to me. We'll survive this." Robb held her a little longer, the tension between them easing, though the shadow of what was to come still lingered at the edges of their minds. He pulled back slightly, looking down at her with a tired, vulnerable expression. "I love you, Rosalind," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. "And I love you, Rob," she replied, her eyes shimmering with the same depth of feeling. "Always." Rob gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, leaning down to press a kiss to her forehead, then her lips. For a moment, everything else faded away, the looming war, the treacherous court, Joffrey's shadow. It was just the two of them, bound together in a promise that no king, no war, no cruel game could sever. Rob let out a long, heavy breath, his eyes lingering on Rosalind as he slowly stepped back. His hand slipped from hers, reluctant, as though every inch of space between them carried the weight of his impending departure. "I need to meet with my men," he said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "We leave at dawn." Rosalind's lips curved into a small, playful smile, though her heart weighed heavy with the knowledge of what his words truly meant. "Then go," she teased softly, giving him a light push. "I'll see you tonight." For a moment, the tension in Rob's face softened, a fleeting smile breaking through the storm of worry etched into his features. He hesitated, as if torn between his duties and the urge to stay just a little longer. Without warning, he reached out, pulling her close again, and pressed a lingering kiss to her lips. It was soft, filled with the quiet desperation of a man who knew he'd have to leave behind what he loved most. When he pulled away, his eyes held hers for a moment longer, the depth of his love and fear unspoken but clear. He turned, glancing over his shoulder once before stepping out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Rosalind stood still for a moment, the room suddenly feeling emptier without him. She exhaled deeply, her hand brushing absently against her lips where his kiss still lingered. She understood how much Joffrey's presence weighed on Rob's mind, how it twisted his thoughts and made him anxious to protect her. But Rob had a war to face, a campaign that would demand every ounce of his focus and strength. The thought of him riding into battle, working with Tywin Lannister and the chaos of war, tightened something in her chest. She had to trust in his strength and skill, just as he had to trust in hers. Whatever Joffrey's twisted games were, she was sure she could handle them. Rob needed to focus on what lay ahead, surviving, winning, and returning to her. Rosalind moved to the mirror, the thick ceremonial gown weighing her down. The heavy layers of fabric constricted her chest, making it difficult to breathe freely. She ran her hands over the intricate designs, the silver thread shimmering in the low candlelight. This was not her, not the woman she needed to be to face Joffrey tonight. She wanted to shed the dress, to feel herself again before facing the Boy King. But just as she reached to undo the laces at her side, there came a soft, gentle tap at the door. Her hand stilled, a shiver of unease trailing down her spine. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her gown, forcing composure into her voice. "Enter." The door creaked open, slow and deliberate, revealing a figure that immediately sent a fresh wave of tension coursing through her. Varys, the King's Master of Whisperers, stepped into the room, his movements fluid and silent, like a shadow. "Lady Stark," he greeted, offering a subtle nod of his head, his expression unreadable, though his eyes gleamed with quiet knowledge. Rosalind's gaze flicked to the door behind him, still slightly ajar, before settling back on Varys. His presence, though unsettling, was not unexpected. In King's Landing, nothing escaped the spider's web, and her name had undoubtedly caught in its threads. "Lord Varys," she replied, keeping her voice steady, though her pulse quickened beneath the weight of his silent scrutiny. Rosalind remained still, her pulse a steady drumbeat as Varys approached. His steps were so light they barely disturbed the air around him, yet his presence filled the room. He closed the door gently behind him, the faint click echoing ominously in the silence. "I hope my presence isn't an inconvenience," Lady Stark, Varys said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. He clasped his hands together in front of him, his robes flowing around him like the shadows he was so accustomed to walking through. "I come merely as a concerned friend, though we are not yet friends, are we?" Rosalind narrowed her gaze, unsure of his intentions. "I didn't think concern was a luxury we afforded one another here." A small smile tugged at Varys' lips, though it never quite reached his eyes. "In this place, my lady, concern is the rarest of luxuries. And yet, I find myself troubled by the way our dear king gazes upon you." Rosalind stiffened, but she did not speak. She had been right, Varys saw everything. You are intelligent, Lady Stark, Varys continued, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. You know Joffrey's nature, and I needn't remind you of the dangers he poses. You may be safer if you align yourself with those who can help you. His words were laced with a subtle but unmistakable offer. Rosalind folded her arms over her chest, her expression guarded. And you think you can help? The question hung in the air for a moment, and Varys studied her, his eyes flicking briefly to the heavy ceremonial gown she wore, as if assessing the weight of her burdens. Help is always available, my lady. But it is often a question of how much you want it. Rosalind clenched her jaw, her thoughts racing. She had no love for Joffrey and knew well enough the kind of man he was. His gaze had lingered on her far too often, his words teetering on the edge of propriety. And yet, she could not show weakness, not now. What is it you want, Lord Varys? She asked finally, her voice steady, though she felt the tension coiling tighter inside her. Varys tilted his head, his smile never fading. I want what's best for the realm, my lady. And, in this moment, that means ensuring your safety, and perhaps, the safety of those you love. The mention of her family, of Robb, sent a chill through her. Most of those I care for leave tomorrow. Robb can take care of himself. Of course, Varys agreed smoothly, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. Though of course, you will remain with little Sansa. The game we play here is one of shadows and whispers. Battles fought not with swords, but with secrets. And in that game, Lady Stark, allies are invaluable. Rosalind met his gaze, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the future pressing in, the heavy uncertainty of the path that lay ahead. Could she trust him? Or was he just another player trying to secure his position? She took a slow breath, keeping her expression unreadable. If I were to accept your offer of help, what exactly would you expect in return? Varys smiled again, this time more genuinely, though it still sent a shiver down her spine. Only your trust, my lady. I truly would like to be your friend. For a moment, silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Rosalind could feel the pull of the choices before her, each more dangerous than the last. Finally, she nodded, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. Very well, Lord Varys. I look forward to a long friendship between us. Varys inclined his head deeply, a gesture of respect. Wise, my lady. Very wise. With that, he stepped back toward the door, his movements graceful and unhurried. I shall leave you to your evening, my lady. Without another word, he slipped out of the room, leaving Rosalind standing alone, her heart racing as the full weight of his words settled over her. __________. Rosalind found herself once again walking the familiar, foreboding path between her chambers and the king's. She had shed the heavy ceremonial gown for something lighter, a simple slip dress layered with a grey overlay that flowed softly as she moved. The weight of the evening's events pressed on her, but she pushed it aside. Tonight, her aim was simple, get in and out as quickly as possible. As she neared Joffrey's quarters, she steeled herself, knowing this would not be her last visit. Once Robb left for the campaign, her time with the king would inevitably increase, affording her more opportunities to play her own game. But tonight, her only plan was to return to Robb's side, to hold on to these last few hours before the tide of war pulled him away. The King's Guard flanked the door to Joffrey's chambers, their expressions impassive as they pushed it open for her. As the door creaked wide, it revealed Joffrey standing at his desk, his attention fixed on a mess of papers strewn across its surface. He didn't look up, but Rosalind felt the weight of his presence the moment she stepped inside. Your Grace, she said, sinking into a deep, graceful curtsy, her eyes never rising from the floor. Slipping into the role she had crafted for herself around Joffrey was truly easy for her. It was how she managed to navigate these moments, by convincing herself that she wasn't truly Rosalind Stark, wife of Robb, Lady of Winterfell. No, here she was Rosalind Free, daughter of Walder, a woman driven by ambition, a social climber playing her part in the dangerous game of the court. It was a mask she wore well, even as it ate away at her beneath the surface. Ah, Rosalind, Joffrey sneered, barely glancing up from the table before gesturing for her to rise. I've been waiting. Come here, I need your advice on something. Of course, Your Grace, Rosalind replied, her voice steady as she stepped forward with deliberate grace, crossing the room to stand at his side. As she reached him, her eyes drifted down to the table. Joffrey was meticulously shuffling through a series of cards, each one depicting a portrait of a young woman with a name scrawled beneath. Her brow furrowed slightly as she recognized the sigils and house names: Redwyne, Celtigar, Lefford, each card representing a lady from one of the great houses of Westeros. Joffrey arranged the cards with a slow, deliberate precision, each movement tinged with a cruel amusement. "My mother," he began, his voice thick with mockery, "thinks it's time I became a man." Roslyn's stomach churned, but she held her composure as his eyes flicked toward her, gauging her reaction. "And since your sweet sister-in-law isn't ready to share my bed," he continued, a sneer curling his lips, "my dear mother has suggested I take a mistress like so many of the kings who have sat the throne before me." His fingers hovered over one of the cards, tapping it lightly before turning to her again, watching, waiting. Roslyn felt her heart quicken, but she kept her expression neutral, knowing any flicker of emotion would only spur him on. "My whole life," Joffrey drawled, "I've been told how vital it is for a woman to remain loyal to her husband, how crucial it is for girls to be chaste, and that it's a man's duty to protect their innocence until marriage." His tone shifted, dripping with disdain. "Yet here we are, noble houses scrambling to present their daughters the moment they learn the king desires a whore." As Roslyn's gaze flicked over the cards sprawled across the table, a sickening realization washed over her: there must be nearly 100 of them, each representing a lord offering up his daughter or sister to Joffrey, laid out before him like a banquet. Her eyes finally landed on one particular card, and her breath caught in her throat. Initially startled, she quickly came to terms with the inevitability of it. There, in bold letters, was the name she dreaded: Walder Frey. "So, Roslyn," Joffrey said, a smirk playing on his lips as he noticed her lingering on the card, "who should I choose?" "Whoever you like most, Your Grace," she replied, quickly slipping back into her character. "And what if I can't have who I want most?" Joffrey asked, his tone shifting as he placed his hand over hers, which rested on the table. Roslyn fought the instinct to pull away, understanding all too well the implication behind his words. She couldn't afford to reject him outright, she needed to redirect him. "Your Grace, you are the king. You can have anyone you desire," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension crackling between them. Joffrey leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied her reaction. "That's the problem, isn't it? There are always limitations, especially when it comes to the likes of me." His voice dripped with mock sorrow, but the edge in it was unmistakable. Roslyn inhaled slowly, careful to choose her words wisely. "Perhaps you could consider who would serve your interests best. A mistress can be more than a fleeting pleasure." She gently withdrew her hand from beneath his and began to shuffle through the cards on the table. Joffrey raised an eyebrow, a spark of intrigue flickering in his eyes. "Go on. Imagine a lady who could enhance your standing, someone whose family could forge valuable alliances for you," she continued, her gaze steady on him as she selected a few cards that bore the names of families with significant influence. Joffrey grasped her hips, pulling her closer to him, and Roslyn felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She thought of Robb and how this would tear him apart, but she repeated in her mind, "This isn't you. You think I should use them like pawns on a board." Joffrey mused, his fingers pressing into her side with a possessive grip. "Exactly," Roslyn said, allowing a hint of confidence to seep into her voice. "You're not just a king, you're a player in a larger game. Choose a lady who can bring value to your reign." He smiled, a sinister gleam flickering across his face. "And what about you, Roslyn? Are you saying you wouldn't mind if I took a mistress?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "I am merely a servant to your desires, Your Grace. My opinions matter little in the grand scheme." "Ah, but they matter to me," he said, pulling his hand away and leaning back against the desk, a calculating glint in his eyes. "You matter to me, Roslyn." Roslyn's heart raced as she met his gaze, sensing the unsettling truth in his words. Joffrey was a danger in the best of times, but now he seemed delusional, convinced that he cared for her and she for him. She steeled herself, responding, "I am here to serve you, Your Grace, in whatever capacity you require." "Good," he said, his tone casual, though his eyes were anything but. "Now, tell me about the Free girl. Is she as meek as she appears?" The question hung in the air, and Rosalind's mind raced. She had to tread carefully, knowing any misstep could land her in dangerous territory. Wilder is eager to please, Your Grace. She has much to offer, though her family may not be as influential as others. Eager to please? Joffrey echoed, a smirk creeping back onto his face. I think I'd like that. As Joffrey picked up Wilder's card, a cold shiver ran down Rosalind's spine. They moved on to discuss several other girls, with Rosalind offering her thoughts, each comment treated by Joffrey as undeniable truth. The conversation dragged on, and Rosalind quietly longed to be dismissed. Throughout, Joffrey's flirtations became more brazen, his fingers brushing against hers, a hand lingering on the small of her back, each touch making her stomach churn. Yet she maintained her composure, knowing any wrong move could shift the delicate balance she walked. Joffrey's gaze lingered on her as he placed the final card down, the smirk on his face growing more twisted with each passing second. He reached out again, his fingers grazing hers. You've been most helpful, Rosalind, he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. It's rare I get such thoughtful counsel. Rosalind forced a smile, her pulse quickening beneath the surface. I'm glad to be of service, Your Grace. Joffrey circled her slowly, his gaze predatory, never breaking from her face. Tell me, he murmured, his voice low and dangerous, do you think Robb truly appreciates what he has? Rosalind turned sharply to face him, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. She would not cower, not now. Their eyes locked, and Joffrey's smirk deepened. He stepped closer, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, an action meant to seem tender but laced with possessiveness. For a brief, horrifying moment, he leaned in as if to kiss her. Rosalind's pulse raced, her chest tightening with dread. She knew what was coming, the twisted game he was trying to play. Every instinct told her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm, to stay composed. She could not show weakness now. If there's nothing else, Your Grace, she said, her voice steady but cold as ice, I should return to my husband. He leaves at dawn, and I wish to spend the rest of this evening with him. Joffrey paused, his face inches from hers. His eyes flickered with something dangerous before he finally pulled back, a thin, mocking smile on his lips. Of course. Go to your wolf while you still can. She gave a small curtsy and left the room as calmly as she could manage, feeling Joffrey's eyes on her until the door closed behind her. Once alone in the hallway, she allowed herself a deep breath, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. Rosalind hurried back to her chambers, her heart aching for Robb. As she reached their door, she paused for a moment, gathering herself. She pushed the door open and found Robb standing by the window, staring out into the darkened city. I'm back, she said softly, her voice carrying the strain of the encounter with Joffrey. Robb turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and relief. Are you all right? Rosalind nodded, but as she stepped toward him, the tension she'd been holding in broke, and she found herself falling into his arms. I just need you, she whispered, clinging to him as though he were the only thing keeping her grounded. Robb held her tightly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'm here, Rosalind. I'm always here. But the dread of what was to come still lingered in the back of her mind, Joffrey's twisted obsession and the dangerous game she was forced to play. Tomorrow, Robb would leave, and she would be left alone in the lion's den. Chapter 15, Robb 6. Chapter text. Robb 6. Robb held Rosalind tightly against him, feeling her body tremble. A wave of concern washed over him, and he wanted to ask what he had done, but deep down he feared the answer. Rosalind pressed her face into his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of him, earthy and warm, a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in her heart. Robb gently pulled back to look into her eyes, searching for answers in the depths of her distress. Rosalind, are you okay? He asked, his voice a mixture of concern and confusion. She hesitated, the weight of her encounter with Joffrey pressing heavily on her. It's nothing, just been a long day, she managed to say, though her voice wavered. Robb frowned, not convinced. You can tell me anything. You know that. Rosalind looked up at him, her trembling gradually subsiding. Please, I don't want to spend our last night together talking about him. Gently, she wrapped her hand around his neck and pulled him down to her, kissing him deeply, as if trying to anchor herself to him and not let go. Robb pulled away, sensing her turmoil, and he didn't want her to bottle up her feelings. The expression on her face was one of surprise. "Roslyn, please don't shut me out." Roslyn took a breath, the weight of the moment hanging between them. "I'm not trying to shut you out, Rob," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I want you tonight. I want you to have me like it's the last time we will ever be together." Rob's heart raced at her words, a rush of emotion flooding him. He cupped her face in his hands, searching her eyes for any hint of uncertainty. "Roslyn, we have time." "Maybe not enough time," she interrupted gently, her gaze steady. "I want to feel you, right now." He leaned down, capturing her lips with his, deepening the kiss as the weight of the day melted away. She pressed against him, her hands weaving through his hair, anchoring him to her. The warmth of their bodies ignited a fire within him, and all his worries faded into the background. She gently broke their kiss and walked over to the bed, her movements fluid and graceful. As she removed her overdress, she revealed the delicate slip beneath, the fabric clinging softly to her form. Rob stood mesmerized, his eyes tracing the curve of her silhouette, drinking in the beauty of every motion she made. He followed her, his heart racing, and positioned himself at the side of the bed, just in front of where she now lay. Leaning in closer, he let his thumb glide gently across her lips, savoring the softness of her skin. The warmth of her breath mingled with the tension in the air, and he felt an overwhelming urge to bridge the distance between them. His gaze lingered on her eyes, searching for permission, as he traced the outline of her mouth, feeling the electric connection that surged between them. In that moment, everything else faded away, leaving just the two of them and the unspoken promises that hung in the air. Roslyn pulled back slightly, her cheeks flushed, eyes bright with intensity. "Rob, I need you to promise me something," she said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "Anything," he replied. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll remember this night. Remember us." He nodded, his expression resolute. "I promise, Roslyn. Always." He ran his hand up her thigh and under her dress as she continued, "Even after a long battle, when you're exhausted and there are a dozen whores waiting at your tent, pleading to share your bed. I'll turn them away and think only of you," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, a fierce sincerity in his eyes. His hand continued to travel up and her dress raised as he did so, revealing more of her body. He rested it on her waist as she continued. "Don't lie, Lord Stark," she teased, a playful smile dancing on her lips. "When you're all alone, you're telling me you would turn away a beautiful woman." Rob raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Are you trying to test my resolve, my lady?" Roslyn leaned closer, her voice low and teasing. "Oh, come now. You can't expect me to believe that every nobleman doesn't have his weaknesses. A moment of weakness with a beautiful woman would mean nothing, wouldn't it?" He chuckled, a rich, warm sound that filled the space between them. "How could I be with anyone else when I know the most beautiful woman in all the realms is waiting for me? Especially one who carries my child, my heir." His gaze held a mix of affection and determination, and Roslyn felt a flutter in her chest. The weight of his words wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, anchoring her in the truth of their bond. Roslyn's smile softened, and she felt a flutter of warmth spread through her chest. "Then I suppose I should be flattered," she replied, teasingly. Rob's hand slipped from her waist as he climbed onto the bed, his broad frame looming over her, casting her in shadow. His presence was both protective and commanding, his gaze never leaving hers, filled with a raw intensity that made her breath catch. Leaning down, his warm breath brushed against her skin, lingering just above her face. He paused, his lips close to her ear, and whispered, "Take it off." He stood back from her and watched as she did as he instructed. Her body was still trim and was yet to show the signs of the child she carried. Rob felt a pang of longing as he considered how much he would miss this moment. The next time he saw her, she would likely be heavy with their child, and he had dreamed of watching her blossom. He longed to witness the transformation as their child grew, stronger and more vibrant within her. Once she was undressed, she positioned herself back on the bed and Rob raced to undress himself. He walked across to her, tracing up her legs, across her waist and finally cupping her breast. He wanted to savor every detail of her, to commit to memory the way the light caught her hair, the softness of her skin, and the warmth of her laughter. In that moment, He felt an overwhelming desire to take his time, to explore every curve and contour, to memorize the way her eyes sparkled with mischief and joy. He wanted to imprint her image in his mind. "Rob," she purred, "I need you." She pulled him from his daydream and back to where they were. He smirked at her playfully and, with a swift motion, grabbed her ankles, pulling them down until she lay flat on her back. She let out a surprised squeal as she fell back against the soft sheets. He positioned himself between her legs, and with one finger delicately touched against her entrance, she was already anticipating him, and it took Rob no effort to push inside her. As he did, Rosalind bucked against him, so needy and wanting. He intended to play with her and repeated the action slowly, again and again, feeling her writhe under him each time he did so before he eventually inserted another finger. With that, Rosalind began to softly moan, her voice barely above a whisper as she pleaded, "Please, Rob." Rob had known lust before. He had slept with whores in Winterfell after Theon had dragged him to a local brothel, but he had never known anything like this. With them it had been selfish, he had only thought of himself, but with Rosalind, he wanted nothing more than to hear her call his name, to feel her come undone on his fingers. With one swift movement, Rob brought his head to her sex and began to circle Rosalind's clit with his tongue. Rosalind's moaning increased tenfold as Rob increased the speed of his fingers. It didn't take long until Rosalind reached her peak. She bucked underneath him, moaning his name as he refused to stop until he was sure she had completely come down. Rob brought himself to her face and kissed her deeply, and gently ran his thumb across her swollen clit. She jolted suddenly and shot a look of teasing disapproval at him as he laughed. "You have to come back to me, Rob," Rosalind said, her teasing tone underlined by a deep sincerity in her eyes. "I, Robb Stark, swear that I will fight tooth and nail," he replied, a fierce determination in his voice. "I'll slay monsters and beasts, and I'll claw my way out of the seven hells themselves just to return to you." He lay beside her, drawing lazy circles on her stomach with his fingertips. "And besides," he added with a chuckle, "you're far too beautiful to be a widow." Rosalind couldn't help but laugh as she playfully shoved him away, her heart lightened by his words. Rob rolled onto his back, feigning offense as he placed a dramatic hand over his heart. "I meant no offense, my lady, I am merely stating a fact." Rosalind laughed, the sound ringing like music in the dimly lit room. She leaned over him, her hair falling in a cascade around their faces. "You think that will save you from my wrath?" He grinned, capturing her wrist and pulling her down closer. "I welcome your wrath, my lady." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the world outside faded away. "Just promise me you'll stay safe, no unnecessary heroics," she murmured, her expression shifting to one of earnest concern. "I can bear the thought of many things, but losing you." Rob's expression softened as he brushed a stray hair from her face. "You won't lose me. I'll return, and when I do, I want to hear your laughter echoing through Winterfell." In a sudden, playful motion, he swept Rosalind up, flipping her onto her back with a gleeful laugh, his body hovering above hers. "But for now, I'll need something to help me through those long, lonely nights," he said, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Rosalind laughed softly, her heart racing as he hovered over her. "And what might that be, my lord?" With a glint of mischief in his eyes, he brushed his lips against hers, teasingly light at first. "The memory of what it feels like to make love to my wife," he murmured. He moved quickly to position himself at the entrance and pushed himself inside her. She was still wet and ready from his earlier attentions. As he buried himself inside her, Rosalind gave a deep moan that only encouraged Rob further. He pushed deeper inside her, feeling her around him. He moved slowly, determined to enjoy every moment. He ran his hand slowly across her thigh as he pulled it up to grant him further access into her. Beneath him, Rosalind groaned against him, getting louder and louder until he crashed his mouth into her. They moved together, each craving more connection, more feeling. Rob pushed into her harder and faster, knowing that his end was near, but he wanted her with him. Reaching between Rosalind's legs, he began to quickly work her clit, which only caused her to moan deeper against his lips. Rob felt the intense pleasurable feeling surge through his body as he came inside her, only for Rosalind to follow not longer after. Once they had both come down, Rob moved to pull away from her, but Rosalind stopped him and the two of them locked eyes. "Just a bit longer," she begged, "please, just a moment." He was happy to oblige and remained where he was, burying his head deep into the side of her neck as she ran her hands through his hair. Underscore 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 underscore. The air was heavy with stillness in the frozen night. Rob found himself standing in the heart of a dense forest, surrounded by towering trees, their branches weighed down by thick layers of snow. The biting cold stung his cheeks and filled his lungs with each breath, but he felt little discomfort. His attention was drawn elsewhere. As he stood at the edge of a frozen pond, he leaned closer to the surface. In the mirror-like reflection of the water, he caught sight of a lone wolf. Its silhouette was strong and graceful, a ghostly figure moving with purpose through the silent woods. Its fur thick and silver, nearly blending into the snow-covered landscape. Rob retreated and he noticed the deep impressions left behind, paw prints that carved their way through the pristine blanket of white. He knew he needed to find something, he was desperate. Rob moved silently, his breath came in quick bursts, visible in the cold air, as he scanned the woods with growing urgency. The forest felt endless, the thick snow making it harder to push forward, but he never stopped. He pressed on, determined. The silence of the woods was broken only by the crunch of snow beneath his paws. Rob could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, syncing with the rhythmic steps that he took. Then, after what felt like an eternity of searching, he paused. Ahead, through a break in the trees, lay a small clearing bathed in soft moonlight. At its center was another wolf, lying in the snow. Rob's heart raced. The second wolf looked injured, its fur matted with patches of snow and ice. It struggled to rise, its legs trembling, but collapsed again with a faint whimper. Rob approached cautiously, sniffing the air, his head low as he circled the other wolf. But as it drew closer, Rob saw the truth: the wolf wasn't injured. It had just given birth. A small, wriggling pup lay beside it, its fur slick and dark, barely visible against the mother's body. Rob, once frantic and driven, lowered his head gently to nuzzle the mother wolf, reassuring her. The tension of the search melted away, replaced by a deep sense of calm and completion. Rob felt relief, joy, and something more, a sense of renewal, of life beginning anew amidst the frozen world. The pup squirmed closer to its mother, letting out a tiny yelp that echoed in the stillness. There was something about the newborn, something powerful and fragile all at once. It was a promise, a future that had been fought for. As the wolves settled in the snow, Rob laid protectively beside the mother and pup. He understood now what he had been searching for all along. In the distance, the first rays of dawn began to break through the treetops, casting a soft light over the scene. Rob could feel the warmth on his skin, melting the frost, but as the world began to brighten, the dream started to slip away, fading into the mist of morning. With a start, Rob awoke, his heart still pounding in his chest, the vivid image of the wolves lingering in his mind. He lay still for a moment, the remnants of the dream swirling like fog around him, filling him with an inexplicable sense of urgency. Turning his head, he found Roslyn asleep beside him, her features softened in the early light. The gentle rise and fall of her chest brought him comfort. The morning light painted her in warm hues, illuminating the delicate strands of hair that fell across her face. Rob reached out, brushing a stray lock behind her ear, careful not to disturb her slumber. As he watched her, he thought of the wolf he had seen in his dream, the one searching for something vital. What was he searching for? And why did it feel so connected to him? The questions lingered like the fading shadows in the corners of the room. But for now, all that mattered was the warmth of Roslyn beside him, the promise of their time together before the day would inevitably pull them apart. Underscore 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 underscore. Dawn arrived all too quickly, and Rob found himself dressed for his journey, standing at the Dragon Gate, ready to depart. He hadn't brought much to King's Landing, so there was little to pack. His clothes were all he needed for the road ahead, the rest of his belongings would remain until he returned after the war. Yet, as he looked around, he saw carts brimming with luggage. Arya and Ned had brought everything they had traveled with months ago, each piece carefully secured for their return to Winterfell. The sight of the familiar belongings tugged at his heart, a reminder of home and the family he longed to protect. Sansa and Roslyn stood on the castle steps, their faces etched with sadness as they observed the men busily loading carts and preparing for their journey. While everyone else was poised to depart, they were left behind, feeling the weight of impending separation. Rob approached them, his steps purposeful, eager to share a moment before the inevitable goodbyes. As the carts rolled by, laden with supplies and armor, Sansa hugged her arms tightly around herself. "I can't believe they're leaving us here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Roslin turned to her, searching Sansa's face for understanding. "It's only for a little while," she replied, trying to inject some hope into her words. "Robb will return, and when he does, we'll be together again." Sansa nodded, her voice tinged with worry. "Yes, and then he'll take you away, and I'll be truly alone." Her words trailed off as Robb reached them at the top of the steps. "Sansa, you must be careful with what you say. Joffrey will be your husband, try to make your peace with that," he reminded her gently. Robb glanced down the steps and noticed his father and Arya approaching, the weight of the moment settling in. He turned to Roslin, his expression serious. "It's time," he said softly. Sansa's gaze dropped to the ground, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Roslin placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some reassurance. "You're not alone, Sansa," she said softly, her heart aching for her sister-in-law. Robb felt the tension in the air as he shifted his weight, the reality of their departure pressing down on him. He wanted to reach out to Sansa, to reassure her, but he knew words would only go so far. Just then, their father reached the top of the steps, his expression solemn. Arya followed closely behind, her youthful face a mixture of confusion and determination. "Robb," Ned said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you ready?" Robb took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "I am, father." Robb stood by, his heart heavy as he watched the bittersweet farewell unfold. Arya and Sansa embraced tightly, their arms wrapped around each other. Sansa's voice trembled slightly as she whispered something in Arya's ear, a small, private reassurance meant only for her sister. Robb could see the tears glistening in Sansa's eyes, reflecting the early morning light like fragile crystals. Arya, always the stronger of the two, squeezed Sansa tighter, her own expression a mix of determination and sorrow. As they finally pulled away, Sansa wiped at her cheeks, trying to maintain her composure, but the tremor in her lip betrayed her. Ned stepped forward, his presence a steady anchor amidst the emotional whirlwind. He knelt slightly to meet Sansa's gaze, his eyes softening as he brushed a gentle hand through her auburn hair. The familiar gesture spoke volumes, a father's love, a silent promise of support even in their separation. "Sansa," he began, his voice rich with warmth and sincerity, "I want you to know how deeply I love you." His words wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, soothing the anxiety that swirled in her heart. "I am so proud of the woman you are becoming." Sansa's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, the weight of his approval filling her with a bittersweet blend of joy and sadness. She leaned into his touch, finding solace in the connection they shared. "I'll be okay, father," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Ned smiled, a mix of pride and sorrow flickering across his features. "You are stronger than you think," he assured her, his gaze unwavering. "Remember that, no matter what happens." As they pulled away from the embrace, the moment felt suspended in time, a cherished memory that would linger long after their parting. Arya turned and dashed toward Roslin, wrapping her arms around her in a quick but heartfelt embrace. "I will miss you so much, Arya," Roslin said, her voice thick with emotion as she held the girl tightly for a moment longer. Ned watched the exchange, his gaze shifting to Roslin as he added with a father's gravity, glancing at Sansa as he said, "Keep her safe." The weight of his words hung in the air, a silent plea mingled with the bond they all shared. Roslin nodded, her resolve firm. "I promise," she replied, the sincerity in her tone reassuring. With a last glance at each other, Arya and Ned began to make their way down the steps. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Ned directed Arya to the carriage that would carry her on the month-long journey back to Winterfell. She climbed in, looking back over her shoulder one last time, her expression a mix of determination and longing. Ned mounted his horse, his posture commanding yet tender as he scanned the gathered party, preparing for their departure. "Sansa," Robb said softly as he noticed his sister's tears spilling over, her composure unraveling further. "I will be back soon. By then, you'll be a lady grown, and we can plan your wedding together. You'll be queen." "I don't want to be queen anymore," Robb, Sansa replied, her voice choked with sobs. "I just want to go home." "Sansa, you need to stop this," Robb urged quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "You have to take care of Roslin just as she takes care of you." Promise me you'll do that. I promise, Sansa said, her voice trembling but resolute, as she wiped her tears away. The weight of his request settled between them, a bond of responsibility that would tether them even in his absence. Robb turned to Roslyn, his heart heavy. He reached for her hands, holding them tightly between them. I'll be back, I promise, he said, trying to infuse his voice with certainty. No matter what happens out there, I'll return to you. Roslyn's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she managed a small, brave smile. I know you will. He nodded, his grip tightening as if to anchor them both in this moment. Just stay strong for me, and look after Sansa. I will, she replied, her voice steadying. And I'll be here waiting for you, counting the days. They leaned in closer, and in that shared breath, the world around them faded. Robb brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. I love you, Roslyn, more than I thought possible, he whispered, his words laced with all the emotions he struggled to articulate. I love you too, Roslyn said softly, her voice a gentle echo of his. Robb hesitated, then pressed his lips to hers, the kiss both tender and desperate, as if trying to imprint this moment in his memory forever. Time seemed to suspend as they savored the taste of each other, a bittersweet reminder of what was at stake. Finally, they pulled away, the reality of their situation crashing down around them. Robb took a deep breath, forcing himself to step back, though every part of him wanted to remain. Stay safe, my lady, he said, a hint of a smile returning to his lips despite the sadness in his heart. With one final lingering glance, Robb turned to rejoin the others. He spotted his horse waiting by his father, who gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. I remember what it was like to leave your mother for the first time, Ned said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. We'd only been married a week when she waved me off from Riverrun. It was difficult, and I didn't love her yet, not fully, at least. I cared for her, of course, but when I returned, she was holding you in her arms. Father, Robb began, turning to meet Ned's gaze. Roslyn is with child. Chapter 16, Catelyn 2. Chapter text. Catelyn 2. It was early morning when Catelyn Stark stirred from sleep, the faint grey light of dawn barely penetrating the heavy drapes of her room in Harrenhal. The chamber, though grand in size, was as cold and forbidding as the rest of the castle. High ceilings loomed above her, and the walls, scarred by fire centuries ago, seemed to still carry the scent of charred stone. The air inside was thick with an ancient, lingering smoke, and the mournful whistle of wind echoed through the long, empty corridors like the cries of restless spirits. Harrenhal was a place steeped in ruin, a fortress that felt more like a tomb than a seat of power. Catelyn had been confined here for nearly a whole moon turn, waiting in anxious silence for news from King's Landing. Lord Bolton, who had taken command after Robb left for the capital, ruled the keep with a cold, unyielding presence. Unlike her son, Bolton offered her no counsel, no updates. Though it was never explicitly stated, the message was clear: she was not welcome in his councils, an outsider in a place that now felt more oppressive with each passing day. The solitude gnawed at her, save for the small comfort she found in the frequent letters from Roslyn, her daughter-in-law, who wrote faithfully from the capital. And there were the precious letters from Robb, though fewer in number, which she clutched to her chest in her loneliest moments. But the letter that had moved her to tears, the one she still reread every night before bed, had brought news she dared not even hope for: Ned was to be freed. Soon, he would join her here at Harrenhal. She didn't know when exactly he would arrive, but each morning, as she woke in the eerie quiet of the castle, she clung to the fragile hope that today would be the day they were reunited. It was the thought of seeing him again, of holding him after so many months apart, that kept her from succumbing to the weight of the castle's dark history. Every dawn was a promise of hope. Catelyn had developed a routine during her stay at Harrenhal, taking to the battlements every morning in an attempt to find some solace. Though she bore the name Stark, she was a Tully of Riverrun at heart, and the riverlands surrounding the castle, despite their often grey and somber skies, brought her a measure of peace. The winds that swept over the landscape, carrying the scent of earth and water, reminded her of home, where the river Trident flowed strong and steady. This morning was no different. After dressing, she began her usual circuit around the grounds. The air was brisk, a sharp contrast to the stifling darkness inside the castle. As she gazed down from the battlements, her eyes fell upon the courtyard below, now teeming with Lannister soldiers. Tywine and Jaime had arrived 3 days prior, and since their arrival, it seemed Harrenhal had fallen completely under their control. The red and gold of House Lannister banners fluttered over the walls, a vivid contrast to the cold stone beneath them, making the place feel even more foreign to her. Catelyn lingered on the battlements, her eyes following the movements of the Lannister soldiers below. They moved with a sense of entitlement, as if Harrenhal had always belonged to them. She knew their presence was a dark omen. Tywine Lannister did not travel without reason, and his being here made her uneasy. Just as her thoughts turned to Robb, she caught a glimpse of Jaime Lannister striding across the courtyard. His golden armor gleamed in the pale morning light, a symbol of his family's wealth and power. He moved with a swagger, a man who knew he commanded attention wherever he went. Catelyn's gaze hardened as she watched him, her mind flashing back to Bran's fall, to the injustice her family had suffered because of the Lannisters. She turned away from the sight, trying to calm the storm of anger rising within her. She had to stay focused, patient. Ned was coming. That thought alone had been her anchor these past moons. The letter she'd received, telling her of his release, had filled her heart with hope, a hope she clung to with every fiber of her being. Soon, they would be reunited. She had to believe that. Making her way down the stone steps, she felt the weight of the castle's oppressive atmosphere close in around her. The halls of Harrenhal were long and cold, the air still carrying the scent of charred stone from its long-ago destruction. Every step echoed, the sound swallowed by the vast, empty corridors. There were whispers that the castle was haunted, that the ghosts of Harrenhal's past roamed its halls, but Catelyn was not a woman who believed in such things. Still, the wind that howled through the narrow windows did give the place a spectral quality. As she reached the main courtyard, she pulled her cloak tighter around her, bracing against the chill. A Stark guard hurried past, and she stopped him with a raised hand. "Has there been any word?" she asked, her voice steady but strained. The guard shook his head. "No, my lady. But if I hear anything, you will be the first to know." Catelyn nodded, though the answer was expected. Every day she asked, and every day the answer was the same. Still, she held on to hope. Ned would come. He had to. Turning her gaze once more to the bustling courtyard, she spotted Lord Roose Bolton in conversation with a Lannister captain. His pale, expressionless face betrayed nothing, as always. Since Robb had left, Bolton had assumed control, and though he was civil enough, Catelyn had never trusted him. His cold demeanor, his quiet voice, it all set her on edge. As she stood lost in thought, Catelyn's gaze drifted once again to Jaime Lannister, striding confidently across the battlements toward a figure she now recognized as his father, Tywine. The two men stood close, engaged in what seemed to be a serious conversation, their expressions unreadable from where she stood. Catelyn's eyes narrowed as she observed them intently, trying to glean any hint of their plans. Her focus was broken abruptly by a shout from a Lannister guard stationed nearby on the battlements. "Riders approaching," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet tension of the morning. Catelyn turned sharply, her pulse quickening. Something was coming. Tywine and Jaime descended the stone steps swiftly, their boots echoing off the walls of the courtyard as they made their way to greet the new arrivals. The Lannister colors draped over them like armor, radiating power and authority. "Lady Stark," came a voice from behind Catelyn. She turned to find Lord Bolton standing there, his eyes cold and unreadable. "Shall we stand together?" he said, gesturing toward the gathering below. Catelyn gave a curt nod, though she found little comfort in his company. She walked alongside him, taking her place just behind Tywine and Jaime, who were now positioned at the forefront, awaiting their guests. Jaime turned, a smirk already playing on his lips. "Lady Stark," he said, his tone light but edged with mockery. "It seems we've been graced with quite an eventful morning." Catelyn kept her voice steady, refusing to rise to his bait. "Indeed, Sir Jaime," she replied coolly. "Good morning, Lord Tywine." Tywine offered her only the slightest nod before turning his steely gaze back to the gates of Harrenhal. As two Lannister guards swung them open, Catelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her heart seemed to stop as she saw the unmistakable sight of the large, grey Stark banners billowing in the wind. She felt as though the ground had been swept from beneath her. Her legs wobbled, and she instinctively gripped Lord Bolton's arm to keep herself upright. The weight of hope and relief surged through her all at once. Tears blurred her vision as they spilled freely down her cheeks. There, at the head of the small party, were Rob and Ned, riding side by side. Seeing them, alive, felt like a dream made real. Her hands trembled, unable to contain the overwhelming emotion flooding her heart. As the party drew closer, Caitlyn's eyes remained fixed on her husband and son, hardly daring to believe they were real. Rob, strong and proud in his armor, rode with the confidence of a lord. Ned, beside him, looked weathered from captivity but unbroken, his familiar face a sight she had longed to see for what felt like a lifetime. The sight of them together, after so much fear and uncertainty, left her breathless. The courtyard had fallen quiet as the Stark banners fluttered in the cold breeze. Even the Lannister guards, usually so insolent, seemed subdued. Tywin stood like a statue, his calculating gaze never leaving the approaching group, while Jaime's expression betrayed curiosity, perhaps even amusement. As Rob dismounted, he saw his mother and gave her the slightest of smiles, a gesture meant to reassure her. She could see the relief in his eyes, though he carried himself with the burden of leadership that had aged him beyond his years. Ned, too, climbed down from his horse, moving slower than she remembered. Caitlyn could no longer contain herself. Breaking away from Bolton's side, she rushed forward, her tears flowing freely. She reached Ned first, throwing her arms around him. His embrace was strong but tender, his hand cradling the back of her head as though comforting her from all the nights of worry. "Caitlyn," he murmured against her hair. "I'm coming home." She pulled back just enough to look into his face, her hands cupping his cheeks. "I feared, every day, I feared," her voice cracked, too full of emotion to finish the sentence. "I know," Ned said softly, his eyes filled with the quiet understanding that only they shared. "But I'm here now." Rob approached, and Caitlyn turned to him, pulling her eldest son into a fierce hug. She could feel the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him, but for this moment, he was just her boy again. "Mother," Rob whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "it's over." She pulled away, her gaze scanning Rob's face, filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "You're safe. Both of you are safe. But, where is Arya?" Before Rob could answer, the sound of a carriage door creaking open drew their attention. Arya leapt out, her small frame moving swiftly across the courtyard. "Mother," she called, throwing herself into Caitlyn's arms. Caitlyn wrapped her daughter in a fierce embrace, holding her as if she might slip away again. Her fingers instinctively threaded through Arya's short hair, a gesture of comfort. Caitlyn pulled back just enough to take in the sight of her daughter. "Your hair, what happened?" Her voice faltered with a mother's worry, but she quickly shook her head, pulling Arya close again. "It doesn't matter. You're safe, and that's all I need." Behind them, the Stark bannermen stood tall and proud, their presence a sharp contrast to the Lannisters who surrounded them. The tension in the courtyard was palpable, a clash of two powerful families standing on the brink of conflict. Tywin's cold, unyielding voice broke the silence. "Lord Stark, welcome to Harrenhal." His words were civil, but there was no warmth behind them. Ned stepped forward, his gaze locking with Tywin's. "Lord Tywin," he said, his tone as controlled as ever. "I trust the terms of my release were honored." Tywin gave a curt nod. "They were." "We have much to discuss," Ned said, his voice calm but edged with a quiet determination. Though steady, a flicker of resolve gleamed in his eyes. Without waiting for a response, he moved past Tywin, heading toward the castle. But Tywin's sharp voice halted him in his tracks. "Yes," Tywin said, his tone as cold and unyielding as stone. "There is much to be discussed, and I intend to do so with the Lord of Winterfell." Caitlyn glanced at Ned, her confusion mirrored in his furrowed brow. "In case it has slipped your mind," Stark Tywin said, his voice as sharp and cutting as steel, "your son is now the Lord of Winterfell, not you. I will speak with Lord Robb about what comes next. As for you, perhaps you could use a few days of rest before returning to Winterfell." With a swift turn of his head, Tywin's cold gaze fixed on Robb. "Lord Stark, join me in the Grand Hall in an hour's time, if you please." Robb gave a curt nod, and without another word, Tywin spun on his heel. Jaime followed closely behind, along with a retinue of guards as they exited, leaving the courtyard heavy with unspoken tension. Roose Bolton stepped forward, his voice smooth and measured. My lords, if you please, let us get you settled in. Later, perhaps, we can convene with the northern lords. Yes, Ned began, just as Robb spoke at the same time. Of course, they exchanged an awkward glance, each cutting off the other mid-sentence. Ned, clearly uncomfortable, nodded and said, "My apologies, my lord." Robb winced, the title coming from his father seeming to cause him visible discomfort, but after a brief pause, he composed himself. "Of course, Lord Bolton," Robb replied. "I'll summon the banners after I meet with the Lannisters." Roose Bolton gave a slight nod, his cold eyes flickering between father and son before he stepped back into the shadows of the castle. The tension lingered in the air, heavy and palpable. Ned cast a glance at Robb, searching for something unspoken, but Robb kept his gaze forward, his jaw clenched. "We'll meet soon," Father Robb said quietly, though there was an edge of determination in his voice. "This is just how things must be now." Ned hesitated, then nodded. I know." Before either could say more, a servant appeared at the edge of the courtyard, bowing deeply. "Lord Stark, the stately rooms are this way," he announced, his voice trembling slightly in the charged atmosphere. Robb gave a single nod, casting one last glance at his father before heading to follow the servant, deep into the castle. "Come along," Catelyn said softly, her voice calm but urging, as she glanced between Ned and Arya. "We're headed this way." Her hand rested gently on Arya's shoulder, guiding her daughter forward, though her eyes lingered on Ned for a moment longer. There was a quiet understanding in her gaze, a shared grief that passed between them without words. They had both seen too much, carried too much, but now was not the time for heavy hearts. By the time darkness enveloped the castle, Catelyn received word that Robb was free to meet with his parents. Throughout the day, she had spent precious hours with Arya, listening intently as her daughter recounted her experiences in King's Landing. Catelyn felt a mix of horror and awe as Arya spoke of her time spent on the streets, her voice filled with a surprising resilience that both worried and impressed her. Ned had remained by their side, a steady presence throughout the day, though he had been unusually quiet. His attention was consumed by a stack of letters, each one had been saved for him to read after his release. Catelyn glanced at him occasionally, sensing his thoughts were far away, entangled in the politics and perils that surrounded them. Catelyn had insisted that Arya be given the room closest to her and Ned, refusing to compromise. It took some gentle persuasion from Ned to convince her not to sleep in the room with their daughter. "She'll be fine, Cat," he assured her, his tone calm and steady. "You've got her back. She's not going anywhere." Catelyn bit her lip, torn between her protective instincts and the need to allow Arya some independence. In the end, she relented, though her heart remained heavy with worry. Catelyn had been seated by the fire, wrapped in Ned's embrace in their chambers, when a firm voice from the door broke the quiet. "Lord Stark," the guard announced, and their son stepped into the room. Catelyn's heart quickened at the sight of Robb, a mixture of pride and concern flooding her senses. He stood tall in the doorway, his expression serious but softening as he caught sight of them. "Mother, father," he said, stepping forward, the warmth of the fire casting flickering shadows across his face. Catelyn rose, leaving Ned's side to meet him halfway, and pulled him into a tight embrace. "How were your meetings?" she asked, pulling back to search his eyes for any sign of his burdens. Robb exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "They were difficult. The lords are restless, and trying to convince them to fight alongside Lannisters is not an easy task. They want to know my next steps. But one thing hasn't changed," Robb said as he sat down across from his parents. "You can't come on the campaign, father." Catelyn immediately began to protest. "But your father is one of the best. And he also betrayed the crown." Robb cut her off, though his tone was gentle. "I'm sorry, mother, but the terms of his release were clear. He can lead no armies and hold no titles, he's no longer Lord of Winterfell, just as you are no longer Lady of Winterfell." Ned, who had been quiet until now, rose slowly to his feet. "It's all right, Cat," he said softly, walking over to her. "My time in King's Landing has changed me." He took her hand, his touch both reassuring and tender. "I'm not the man I once was. My two oldest friends are gone, leaving behind widows and children who will barely remember them. Let us go back to Winterfell. Bran and Rickon have been without us too long." I want to spend the rest of my life with you, watching our children grow, and perhaps, our grandchildren. Ned's voice softened on the word grandchildren and he glanced meaningfully at Rob, a hint of a smile on his face. Caitlyn's eyes shot to her son. You mean, she began, her voice filled with surprise. Rob gave a small, confirming nod. Roslyn is. Caitlyn's voice trembled with disbelief, her hands coming to her mouth. Ned chuckled softly, his eyes warm and full of affection. Since we left King's Landing, and not a moment sooner, I swear, my love, he replied, his gaze shifting back to Rob, a look of pride in his eyes. Rob smiled faintly, though there was a seriousness that lingered beneath the surface. We were going to tell you soon, he said, glancing between his parents. But with everything happening, it didn't feel like the right time. Caitlyn's teasing expression softened as she stepped toward her son, resting a hand on his arm. You'll make a wonderful father, Rob, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But that's why I need you, Mother, Rob said, his voice steady. I need you to protect the North until I return, with Roslyn, and with our child. Caitlyn's eyes softened, the weight of his words settling in. I understand, Rob, she replied, her voice filled with quiet strength. She glanced at Ned, then gently took his hand in hers. We both understand, she repeated, a sense of shared purpose binding them all. Rob nodded, the weight of responsibility clear in his expression, though there was a flicker of relief at his mother's words. I know it's a lot to ask, he said, his voice softer now, but I can't trust anyone else with this. The North is our home, and I need it in safe hands while I'm gone. Caitlyn squeezed Ned's hand, then stepped closer to her son, looking up at him with the fierce love only a mother could possess. Rob, we will do whatever it takes to protect our home, she said firmly. The North will be waiting for you when you return. Her voice softened, carrying both promise and concern. Just make sure you come back to us. Rob gave a solemn nod, his gaze meeting his father's. I will, Mother. I swear it. Chapter 17, Rob 7. Chapter text. Rob 7. Rob woke to the suffocating darkness of the cold, oppressive chambers he'd been given at Harrenhal. He reached instinctively for the familiar warmth of Roslyn beside him, but his hand found only the empty space where she should have been. It had been nearly 2 weeks since he last saw her, yet the loneliness still cut deeply, a hollow ache that gnawed at him with every passing night. Her presence had always been a comfort, her steady breathing, the soft way she mumbled in her sleep, as if lost in her own dreams. Even in the quiet of the night, she always sought him out, her hand or foot brushing against him, needing the reassurance that he was still there. But now, the bed was cold, and the silence pressed in on him like a weight. Worse still, Roslyn was alone, without him there to offer her the same comfort she gave him. The thought of her waking in an empty bed, reaching for him as he had for her, only to find nothing, made the loneliness sharper, more unbearable. He lay still for a moment longer, the cold stone walls of Harrenhal seeming to close in around him, as the memory of Roslyn lingered like a ghost at his side. Rob dressed quickly, the chill of the morning air biting at his skin. As he stepped into the shadowed corridors of Harrenhal, at every turn, he passed Lannister soldiers, their crimson cloaks a stark reminder that he was a guest in enemy territory. The sight of them stirred unease deep within him. His own men had been scattered throughout the keep, assigned to lesser posts, watching the stables, preparing the weaponry, keeping to the edges of the stronghold. Tywin Lannister had explained it away easily enough, claiming that his forces knew Harrenhal better, having been stationed there for a few weeks already, and were therefore more capable of defending it. The reasoning made sense, on the surface, but Rob couldn't shake the feeling that something lay beneath the surface of those words, some subtle maneuver designed to disarm him. Yet, what could he do? He had little leverage, not enough to challenge Tywin directly. The political game was being played around him, and Harrenhal's cold, ancient walls seemed to whisper that he was alone in the heart of it. With every step, the weight of the situation settled more heavily on his shoulders, but he kept his expression calm, his movements deliberate, knowing he couldn't afford to show any sign of uncertainty. Not here. When Rob finally reached the Great Hall, a flicker of disappointment stirred within him at the sight that greeted him. Tywin Lannister sat at the head of the round table, his presence as commanding and cold as ever. To his right sat Jaime, lounging with his usual arrogance, and on the other side, Tywin's brother, Kevan Lannister, quietly observing. The trio, flanked by Lannister banners, made it clear that this was not the gathering Robb had hoped for. He had wished to dine with his parents and sister, to savor what little time he had left with them before duty pulled him away again. But instead, he found himself in the company of enemies, every shared meal feeling like a negotiation, every glance a silent battle. The great hall, though grand and echoing with ancient power, felt colder in their presence, a place where warmth and family seemed far out of reach. Steeling himself, Robb chose his seat deliberately, directly opposite Tywine. He knew that in this hall, perception was everything. He couldn't afford to appear as a boy playing at leadership, not here, not in front of Tywine. No, he needed to sit with the bearing of a great Lord of Westeros, every movement and word reinforcing his position as the Lord of Winterfell. As he settled into his chair, meeting Tywine's gaze without flinching, Robb felt the unspoken tension thicken in the room. It wasn't just a meal, it was a game of wills, and he had to prove he belonged at this table, not as a young man filling his father's shoes, but as a leader in his own right. "Good morning, Lord Stark, I trust you found the accommodations adequate?" Tywine asked, his voice cold but cordial, the question laced with veiled disdain. It was clear he knew exactly how dismal Harrenhal was, but the courtesy of asking played into the larger game. "Of course, Lord Tywine, I'm grateful for House Lannister's hospitality," Robb replied evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. Jaime chuckled, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Ah, Harrenhal, truly a tranquil haven, isn't it?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But I imagine it's not the stones of this place that bother you, Stark. Must be hard being away from that pretty little wife of yours. She's quite the treasure, isn't she?" Robb's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Tywine's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Jaime," he said, the word more of an order than a reprimand. "Leave the boy alone." Jaime raised an eyebrow, surprised by his father's intervention, but Tywine continued without pause. "He's a boy in love, from what I've heard. That's no weakness, it's a strength. It means he's fighting for something, fighting to get home to someone who matters." Tywine's cold eyes flicked to Jaime, his voice hardening. "Something you, perhaps, wouldn't understand." "Thank you, Lord Lannister," Robb said, his voice steady. "But I am no boy. I am the Lord of Winterfell, as my ancestors have been for thousands of years before me." Tywine regarded him with a measured look, the faintest hint of a smirk touching his lips. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "But tell me, Lord Robb of Winterfell, which was the first battle you won? And how many battles have you fought?" The question hung in the air, cutting deeper than Robb had expected. For a moment, he had no response, his silence betraying the gulf in experience between them. Tywine's eyes gleamed with cold calculation. "You are my ally in this war, Stark, but remember, this is my war." The words were spoken with the weight of command, leaving Robb to consider the harsh reality of the battlefield he had entered, not just with swords, but with words and power. "Clear the room," Tywine ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. Without hesitation, most of the occupants rose and filed out swiftly, leaving only Robb and the three Lannisters, Tywine, Jaime, and Kevan. The air thickened with tension as the heavy wooden doors creaked shut behind the last man. Jaime moved across the room with a casual swagger, his golden hair catching the light of the torches that flickered along the stone walls. He picked up a large scroll from a side table, its edges worn from frequent use, and returned to the center of the room. With a practiced motion, he unrolled the map of Westeros, spreading it across the main table where the four men sat. The parchment displayed the sprawling expanse of the Seven Kingdoms, marked with troop movements, borders, and cities. Tywine rose slowly from his seat, his eyes fixed on the map, his hands clasped behind his back as he spoke. "Let's begin." His voice was calm, but beneath it was the weight of years of war and strategy. He placed a finger on the western portion of the map, just above the Stormlands. "We have enemies on all sides," he began, his finger tracing a path to the southwest. "Here, Renly Baratheon gathers his forces, a host larger than we anticipated now that he is backed by the Tyrells. Our scouts report he is moving steadily toward King's Landing." Robb leaned in, his eyes following the path Tywine outlined with his finger. He remained silent, absorbing every detail. "Renly's feeling confident," Tywine continued, his tone almost dismissive. He has the numbers, and he'll want to make a play for the capital. He's foolish enough to believe that numbers alone will win him the Iron Throne. But we need to cut him off, disrupt his march before he reaches the gates of King's Landing. Tywin's finger paused near the black water, his brow furrowing in thought. If we engage him here, in open ground, we'll be at a disadvantage. He'll expect it, and Renly's arrogance will drive him forward. Jaime, leaning over the table, chimed in with a smirk, so we'll lure him in. Make him think he's winning until it's too late. His hand hovered over the map as if already plotting Renly's downfall. He's desperate for glory, and we can use that against him. Robb cut in before anyone else could respond, his voice firm and commanding. You can't meet Renly on the open field, not so close to King's Landing. Jaime scoffed, but Tywin remained calm, his eyes narrowing as he studied Robb. And why not? Tywin asked. Robb leaned over the map, gesturing to the open land surrounding the capital. If you challenge Renly here, he said, his finger tracing the terrain, whoever wins that battle won't have much time to rest before Stannis makes his move. His forces will be fresh, and they'll strike while yours are weakened. You might as well hand him the crown now. Jaime, always quick to challenge, began to protest. So, what? We just let Renly. But Tywin raised a hand, silencing his son. He's right, Tywin said, his voice measured, as he turned his attention back to the map. Stannis is no fool. He could use the chaos to launch an attack on the city directly, and even if we had defeated Renly, we wouldn't have the strength left to defend King's Landing from a fresh army. And I'm not so sure we'd defeat Renly, Robb continued, his voice steady but carrying weight. He's a third son with half a dozen people who could claim the throne before him, yet he's managed to rally a large host in his name. What does that tell you? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. No one spoke, the silence thick with thought. Renly's men are loyal, Robb went on, and they fight not just for him, but for his crown, and for his new queen. Renly may not be the seasoned warrior his brothers are, but he looks like a king, and that's what we need to target. Tywin's brow furrowed as he studied the map, but it was Kevan who spoke first. He's right, Kevan said, nodding. I don't know Renly well, but I know enough about Margaery Tyrell. She's beloved by the people. They won't just be fighting for Renly, they'll be fighting for her. Getting Renly on the throne is simply the means to put her there. The true enemy isn't Renly, it's the Tyrells, Robb said, his tone firm. If you sever their support, Renly has nothing. He'll be left with two choices, surrender or throw himself at Stannis' feet, hoping for mercy. Either way, the Tyrells, or at least what remains of their forces, will turn back to Joffrey. They've no love for Stannis and no reason to fight for him. His eyes moved across the table, gauging the reaction of the Lannisters. Without the Tyrells, Renly's crown is worthless. The tension in the room thickened as Robb's words lingered in the air. Tywin studied the map intently, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table as he contemplated the implications. Removing the Tyrells from the equation is no small task, Tywin said finally, his voice measured but laced with a hint of challenge. They've tied themselves to him through that marriage. They're not just going to give up a place on the throne. Jaime leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his earlier bravado replaced by a more serious demeanor. So what's the plan then, Stark? You think you can convince them to turn against Renly? Robb met Jaime's gaze unflinchingly. Not just convince. We need to exploit their desires. You're right, Margaery is Renly's queen, they are not going to walk away from that without the promise of something better. Robb said, we just have to present Renly as a liability, as a risk, and instead offer them a sure thing. Tywin finally looked up from the map, a calculating gleam in his eyes. It's a risky move, but it might just work. We can use the Tyrells' ambition against them. If we can disrupt Renly's support and weaken his position, we can force him into a corner. Then we need to act swiftly, Robb said, a surge of determination coursing through him. Every moment we delay gives Renly the chance to strengthen his claim, especially if he manages to put a son in Margaery Tyrell. At that, Jaime snorted with laughter. I don't think there's any real risk of that happening. Tywin turned to Jaime, his expression serious. Stark is correct. Even the mere suggestion that Renly has Margaery with child would complicate the game significantly. Rob leaned forward, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. We must send envoys, gather intelligence on their plans, and make our move before he does. No, Tywine said sharply, his gaze unyielding. You will go today. What? Rob replied, surprised. You will write a letter to Renly, informing him that you wish to negotiate, that you want to hear his terms for an alliance, Tywine continued. Then you will ride to his camp to meet him in person. Renly has always been vain, but now he's surrounded by hundreds who will be reinforcing his belief in his superiority. We can exploit that. It's no secret that my grandson's actions toward your house have been less than fair. Renly won't think for a moment that you may have ulterior motives. You want me to lie? Rob said, disbelief etched across his face. To be a guest in his camp and then betray him. We're not asking you to stab him in the back, at least, not literally, Jaime chuckled. Listen, Rob, Tywine said, his voice firm. War is never clean, and no one walks away unscathed. Do you want to return home? To see your wife again? This is how you do it while minimizing the loss of innocent lives. You said it yourself, it wouldn't be hard to take Renly off the board. You can do it in battle, with hundreds of casualties, or you can do it without a single drop of blood spilled. At the cost of my honor, Rob challenged, his voice rising with conviction. What's honor when weighed against survival, boy? Tywine replied, a steely glint in his eye. Rob felt the weight of Tywine's words pressing down on him, a storm of conflicting emotions churning within. You speak as if honor is nothing, but it's the very foundation of who we are, he retorted, struggling to maintain his resolve. Tywine leaned in, his expression unyielding. Honor won't shield you from the sword, Stark. It won't protect your family or ensure your home remains safe. In this world, it's power that secures your future. You can cling to your principles and watch everything you love burn, or you can adapt and survive. Kevan, sensing the tension, interjected. Look, Lord Stark, I get it. You're trying to play the noble hero, but the world isn't as black and white as you think. If you want to protect your people and your house, you might have to make some tough choices. Rob met Kevan's gaze, feeling the frustration bubbling inside him. You think I don't want to protect my family? I just don't want to do it by sacrificing everything I stand for. Tywine's voice remained calm, almost patronizing. And what will you gain by being a martyr? The North needs a strong leader. A leader who can make hard choices. You have the chance to secure your position and protect your loved ones. Don't squander it for the sake of ideals that may not survive this war. Silence filled the room as Rob processed Tywine's words. The prospect of facing Renly and the delicate game of politics ahead was daunting, but the thought of returning to Roslyn, of keeping her safe, drove him forward. Fine, Rob said, his voice steadying. I'll write the letter and ride to his camp. But know this, I won't compromise my integrity. Tywine nodded, satisfied. That's all we ask. You'll be in a position to gauge Renly's intentions. Use that to your advantage. As Rob turned to leave, he felt Jaime's eyes on him. Just remember, Stark, in this game, trust is a luxury few can afford. With a deep breath, Rob steeled himself for what lay ahead. He had made his choice, and now he would play the game, not just for himself, but for the future of his house and the safety of his family. Chapter 18, Roslyn 8. Chapter text. Roslyn 8. 2 weeks had passed since Rob had left King's Landing, and his letters had become short and infrequent. The last she'd heard from him, he had already departed Harrenhal and was heading for Bitterbridge, offering no explanation as to why. Desperate for answers, she had sought out whispers in the court, but all she managed to learn was that Renly Baratheon had made camp there. The lack of information gnawed at her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't understand why Rob would be negotiating with Renly. It left her uneasy, questioning his every move. As much as she hated to admit it, Roslyn had grown accustomed to the capital. She had settled into a routine, and while unease still lingered in the back of her mind, she had adjusted. Most of her days were spent with Sansa, working to deepen their understanding of Westeros and its many houses. They talked about royal etiquette and manners, and Roslyn had even managed to convince a reluctant Maester to teach them about politics and war tactics. Grand Maester Pycelle had grumbled the entire time, insisting that such knowledge was not suited for ladies, but Rosalind remained undeterred. But this morning, she found herself attending to her least favorite duty that had emerged during her time in the capital. In the absence of a hand of the king, Joffrey had taken to holding an open court each week. He listened to the petitions presented to him and decided on a course of action, but he insisted that Rosalind be present at each session to offer him counsel. The persona she had crafted for Joffrey became increasingly effortless to maintain, yet a nagging fear grew within her, that her true self would gradually fade into obscurity. Each evening, she found herself in his chambers, where their interactions blurred the line between flirtation and manipulation. Joffrey would tease her, probing her limits with an insatiable curiosity, eager to see how far he could push her before she withdrew. Rosalind often felt like an actress on a grand stage, performing a role she hadn't auditioned for. His laughter was laced with a thrill that both captivated and unsettled her. Sometimes, she would catch glimpses of the boy behind the crown, but those moments were fleeting and quickly swallowed by his darker impulses. Every day, he made jokes about bedding her, about claiming her for himself and tearing her away from Robb. As he jested, she fought to keep her composure, reminding herself that each smile and playful retort was a protective barrier against his unpredictable nature. She feared that with each passing day, the boundaries between the faked and her genuine self would blur further, until she could no longer discern where one ended and the other began. As Rosalind made her way to the great hall, she caught a fleeting glimpse of her reflection in a window. The sight startled her. She looked strikingly like Cersei, save for the color of her hair. Her locks were styled in the intricate southern fashion, cascading elegantly around her shoulders. On days when she attended court, Joffrey always insisted she wear one of the red and gold gowns he had gifted her, each one a bold proclamation of allegiance to House Lannister. She was painfully aware of the rumors that swirled around her, whispers suggesting she shared Joffrey's bed. Wearing his gifts, adorned in his house colors, did little to quell the gossip. Instead, it only fueled speculation, each gown feeling like a shackle rather than a symbol of favor. The game was survival and Robb would understand. As Rosalind approached the great hall, she found the massive doors already ajar, revealing a bustling room filled with everyone from noblemen to small folk. The air was thick with conversation and anticipation. As she entered, a guard proclaimed, "Lady Rosalind Stark," and the crowd parted, creating a path for her. Many in attendance curtsied or bowed their heads, acknowledging her presence. With only a handful of individuals of higher station in the room, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of indulgence as she thought, this is what it would like to be queen. In her mind, she envisioned a different life, one where Robb had marched into King's Landing at the head of the northern forces. She imagined him seated on the Iron Throne, the conqueror's crown resting atop his head, radiating strength and authority. She pictured herself walking toward him, taking her place at his side, their son nestled on her lap, a symbol of their union and the future they could build together. But as she moved forward, her fantasy was shattered by the reality before her. Instead, she was met with the sight of Joffrey, slumped in his oversized chair, a stark contrast to the image of a true king. He was no monarch but a boy playing a dangerous game, lost in his own sense of entitlement. As Rosalind approached Joffrey, she slipped into her role as effortless. She lowered herself into a deep curtsy, her gown spreading around her like a blooming flower, the fabric pooling elegantly at her feet. With her eyes cast downward, she felt the weight of expectation settle upon her. It was only when Joffrey gestured for her to rise that she lifted her gaze. As she met his eyes, he extended his hand, showcasing the signet ring on his smallest finger, which bore the intricate designs of both a stag and a lion. Rosalind leaned in and pressed a soft kiss upon it, holding his gaze as long as she dared. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension, until finally, she pulled away and took her place at his side, acutely aware of the roles they were both playing in this elaborate dance of power. "Lady Rosalind, you look beautiful today," Joffrey said sweetly, the venom that had once laced his words seemingly vanished. Rosalind recognized, with a twinge of unease, that he genuinely believed they were in love, a secret, forbidden romance destined to be immortalized in songs for generations to come. The notion of King Joffrey and his Lady Rosalind filled her with an unsettling mix of dread and irony. As he smiled at her, she couldn't shake the feeling that their reality was far from the fairy tale he envisioned. Rosalind managed a polite smile, suppressing the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. She turned slightly to observe the bustling hall, searching for any familiar faces among the crowd. As she took her seat, the noise of the hall faded into a dull roar, and she steeled herself for the proceedings ahead. Noblemen and women began to present their petitions, each seeking Joffrey's favor. She listened intently, trying to glean any information that might help her understand the shifting tides of power around them. Joffrey, however, was more interested in his own amusement, often interrupting with snide remarks or laughter at the expense of those who dared to approach the throne. A few more petitions came and went, with Joffrey either making grand promises or cruelly rejecting the pleas. Roslyn sat beside him, maintaining her composed mask. Then, a guard stepped forward and announced with a clear voice, a representative from the Iron Bank of Braavos. At once, the hall seemed to still. A man emerged from the crowd, his appearance immediately setting him apart. He was rotund and bald, dressed in a dazzling array of silks in shades that shimmered under the flickering light of the hall, deep purples, sapphire blues, and rich golds. His rings clinked together as he moved, his fingers heavy with jeweled adornments. Though Roslyn had little experience with the people of Essos, she knew at once that this man hailed from across the narrow sea. "Your Graces," he began, his accent thick, but his words precise. With an elaborate and theatrical bow, he continued, "Firstly, I wish to extend my deepest gratitude to you and your queen for your generous hospitality in welcoming me to your great city, and to your most magnificent home. The Iron Bank of Braavos holds the highest regard for your kingdom, as we do for all who keep their agreements." As he straightened up, Roslyn noticed a ripple of murmurs spread through the assembled crowd. The air thickened with whispered suspicions and quiet gossip. The Iron Bank was known to be a powerful institution, one that kings and queens alike were wise to tread carefully around. Joffrey's lips curled into a lazy smirk. "It is, of course, my pleasure to welcome you to Westeros," he replied, his tone filled with arrogance. "But let me correct you on one point, good sir. The Lady Roslyn is not my wife." He paused, clearly enjoying the attention, his eyes scanning the crowd before falling back on the Braavosi man. "She is my dear friend and confidant, offering her invaluable counsel while her husband, Robb Stark, fights in my campaign." Joffrey let out a soft laugh as if he had said something particularly clever, the condescension dripping from his voice. The court fell uncomfortably silent for a moment, then the whispers started again, only louder this time. To the people of King's Landing, friend and confidant was nothing more than a thinly veiled euphemism. In their eyes, Joffrey had just declared Roslyn to be his whore, a mistress openly acknowledged before the court. The implications of it hit her like a blow, and though she maintained her outward composure, she could feel her stomach twist. Roslyn could sense the eyes of the room upon her, judgment heavy in their stares. She knew how they would interpret this, her fine gowns, the regal seat beside Joffrey, the power he allowed her to wield in public. She could almost hear the rumors spinning out of control, spreading like wildfire through the capital. Every whisper, every sideways glance, would only fuel the perception that she had betrayed her absent husband. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her expression cool, tilting her chin ever so slightly as though unaffected by the slander. She reminded herself, this is survival. Every word, every gesture had to be carefully crafted to keep herself safe, to protect Robb, and to ensure that when the time came, she could leave this wretched place. The Braavosi representative, to his credit, didn't bat an eye at Joffrey's correction. "Of course, Your Grace. My apologies for any misunderstanding to you and to the Lady Roslyn." He bowed again, though this time with a slight stiffness that suggested he had caught the tension in the room. As he began to discuss the true purpose of his visit, the matter of the crown's debts, Roslyn found herself only half listening. Her mind was consumed by the precariousness of her situation. Every day spent here, playing Joffrey's game, brought her closer to danger. The line between being the king's confidant and becoming his prisoner was thinner than she had ever imagined. She only hoped that somewhere, beyond these walls, Robb was fighting to bring her home. Next to be introduced was Lord Paxter Redwyne of the Arbor, with his daughter, Lady Desmara Redwyne. The herald's voice echoed through the hall as the pair stepped forward. Roslyn recognized Desmara instantly. She was one of the young women whom had been put forward after Cersei called for girls to entertain the young king. Joffrey's eyes gleamed as Lord Redwyne and his daughter approached, clearly anticipating a game of his own making. "Lord Redwyne," Joffrey called out, his voice thick with forced politeness. "Thank you for accepting my invitation to court. It has been quite some time since your last visit to King's Landing, has it not?" Lord Paxter bowed, his face carefully composed, though Roslin could see the strain in his eyes. "Yes, Your Grace," he answered. "I have not been in the capital since the coronation of your father, King Robert." "Ah, what a shame it is that you should return now under such difficult circumstances," Geoffrey retorted, the smirk that tugged at his lips making it clear that he was toying with the Lord. His voice dripped with mockery as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the arms of the Iron Throne. "One wonders why your liege lord, the esteemed Mace Tyrell, would dare turn against his rightful king. Does House Tyrell have ambitions we should be aware of?" There was a heavy pause in the hall as Geoffrey's words hung in the air, the tension palpable. Lord Redwyne stiffened ever so slightly, but his response was measured, cautious. "I cannot speak for Lord Tyrell, Your Grace," he replied, choosing each word with care. "But I assure you that House Redwyne stands firmly behind the one true king, King Joffrey Baratheon." Roslin watched Lord Redwyne, noting the flicker of unease in his eyes. He was walking a dangerous line, trying to appease the capricious boy seated before him without stepping too far into the political minefield laid by Joffrey's baiting. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Joffrey's response. Joffrey chuckled, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the Iron Throne's armrest. "Oh, I'm sure you do," he said, his tone flippant. "But perhaps you should remind your lord of the oaths he swore to the crown," Joffrey continued, a sly edge entering his voice. "After all, we wouldn't want to see the Arbor suffer the consequences of any misunderstanding. Would we?" The thinly veiled threat was clear, and Lord Redwyne's face flushed slightly, though he maintained his composure. "Of course not, Your Grace. I will ensure that Lord Tyrell understands the loyalty of House Redwyne to the crown is unwavering." His voice was steady, but Roslin could sense the undercurrent of tension in his words. Beside her father, Lady Desmara stood silently, her eyes fixed on the floor, her posture rigid with unease. She looked as though she might melt into the stone beneath her feet, the weight of the room's attention bearing down heavily upon her. Her long, chestnut hair cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders, the natural sheen catching the light of the torches that lined the great hall. Her pale blue gown, though finely made, did little to mask the tremor of anxiety that rippled through her as she awaited whatever Joffrey might say next. Joffrey's gaze lingered on her, his predatory smile spreading wider as he called out, "Lady Desmara, is it?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear as she stepped forward and immediately dropped into a low, graceful curtsy. "Yes, Your Grace," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the same polished charm that all noble women were trained to exude. Her heart-shaped face was flushed, the delicate blush of her cheeks betraying her discomfort as she stared at the cold stone beneath her feet. Joffrey tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked her over. "I've heard of you, my lady," he said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "News of your beauty and your grace have reached even my ears." Desmara's eyes flickered upward for just a moment before lowering once more, her cheeks flushing a deeper shade of pink. "You are too kind, Your Grace," she murmured, her tone demure as she remained in her curtsy, not daring to rise until Joffrey permitted it. Joffrey leaned back, tapping his fingers idly on the armrest of the Iron Throne. "Too kind, am I?" he mused, his voice teasing as his gaze roved over her. "I wonder, my lord," he said, directing his attention to her father, Lord Paxter, "does your daughter dance as gracefully as she speaks?" Lord Redwyne, visibly flustered by the sudden shift in attention, bowed quickly, his words stumbling over themselves. "Of course, Your Grace. Lady Desmara is well trained in all the arts befitting a noblewoman of her station." Joffrey grinned, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Perhaps we should put that to the test, then. Lady Desmara, come forward." Roslin watched from her seat beside Joffrey, her face calm, but her stomach twisted at the scene unfolding before her. She could see the terror in Lady Desmara's eyes as she took a tentative step forward. It was the same terror Roslin herself had felt countless times, being the focus of Joffrey's cruel games, unsure of what he would ask or how far he would push. Desmara rose from her curtsy, her legs shaky as she stepped closer to the throne. "Your Grace," she said quietly, clasping her hands in front of her to steady them. Joffrey's smirk widened as he regarded her, clearly reveling in her discomfort. "Dance for me, my lady." Show me this grace everyone speaks so highly of. A murmur rippled through the hall, the gathered lords exchanging glances, some stifling gasps of disbelief at the request. Lady Desmara's face paled, her eyes darting to her father, who stood rooted to the spot, powerless to intervene. There was no graceful way out of this demand. Rosalind's heart sank as she watched the young girl, barely more than a child, trembling in her place. She felt a surge of anger toward Joffrey, how easily he wielded power, how carelessly he humiliated those around him for his own amusement. But she knew better than to intervene. To speak up now would only place her in Joffrey's crosshairs, and she could not afford that, not when so much depended on keeping his favor. Lady Desmara swallowed hard, her lips quivering as she spoke. I am not prepared to dance, Your Grace. Her voice wavered with fear, though she tried to maintain her composure. Joffrey's smile faded into a look of displeasure, his eyes narrowing. Not prepared, he repeated, his voice hardening. When your king makes a request, Lady Desmara, you obey. His tone was low and dangerous now, and the atmosphere in the hall shifted from amusement to tension. Lord Paxter took a step forward, his face stricken with concern. Your Grace, please. Silence, Joffrey snapped, cutting him off with a glare. Let your daughter speak for herself. His gaze flicked back to Desmara, who stood frozen, tears threatening to well up in her eyes. Come now, Joffrey said, his voice once again taking on that saccharine tone. It's just a dance. Surely a lady of your talents can manage that. Rosalind clenched her hands in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She knew the humiliation Joffrey sought to impose on the girl, how he delighted in testing the limits of fear and obedience. Forcing a lady of high birth to dance before the court like a common entertainer, to degrade herself for his pleasure, it was a move as calculated as it was cruel. Desmara's eyes darted around the room, searching for some escape, but there was none. Slowly, she lifted her chin and took a deep breath. As you wish, Your Grace, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stepped forward, her movements stiff and awkward as she began to dance, her feet shuffling across the stone floor. There was no music to guide her, no rhythm to follow, only the oppressive silence of the hall and the weight of Joffrey's gaze upon her. The crowd watched in hushed fascination, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Joffrey leaned back in the Iron Throne, his smirk returning as he watched Desmara's awkward, hesitant steps. Faster, he commanded, his voice ringing out through the hall. Show me that grace I've heard so much about. Desmara tried to comply, her movements becoming more frantic, more desperate as she twirled and stumbled, her gown catching underfoot. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Rosalind's heart ached as she watched, but she knew she could do nothing. This was the game they were all forced to play, and there was no winning, only survival. That will do, a voice called from the back of the room, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. A lovely performance, my lady. I'm sure the king would agree, but you can stop now. Heads turned sharply toward the entrance, where a figure was making his way down the aisle, short of stature but commanding all attention. It was a voice everyone in the hall recognized, Tyrion Lannister, the imp of House Lannister. Uncle. Joffrey's voice rang out, sharper than usual, more surprised than angry. What are you doing here? Tyrion gave a sardonic smile as he approached the throne, his eyes flicking to Lady Desmara and her father, who still lingered at the base of the dais. With a kind gesture, Tyrion gave Lady Desmara a light pat on the back. You've suffered enough for one day, my dear, he said softly, and with a grateful, relieved glance, she and Lord Redwyne melted into the crowd, grateful to no longer be at the center of Joffrey's attentions. Tyrion turned back to Joffrey, his keen eyes narrowing as he approached the towering throne. As for me, Your Grace, he continued, his voice dripping with both respect and an undercurrent of reproach, I've been sent by Lord Tywine, to serve as hand of the king until such time that he can take up the position himself. At this, Tyrion handed a sealed scroll to a nearby Kingsguard, who promptly passed it to Joffrey. The young king tore through the wax seal, his eyes scanning the document in silence, though his face betrayed the irritation bubbling beneath his thin mask of royal composure. After a few moments, Joffrey thrust the scroll toward Rosalind, as though he couldn't be bothered with it anymore. Rosalind quickly read over the document herself. It was true, Tyrion was to serve as hand of the king in his father's absence, with the full authority of the position until the war allowed Lord Tywine to return to court. Tyrion's eyes gleamed as he watched Joffrey's barely concealed displeasure. In other words, dear nephew, I've come to ensure this court no longer serves as your personal stage for cruelty and theatrics. Joffrey's face reddened with humiliation, his fists clenching as the low murmur of the court rose in response to Tyrion's subtle rebuke. His gaze flickered toward Roslyn, searching for some sign of reassurance or support, but her face remained a mask of calm neutrality, her eyes giving nothing away. In that moment, she felt his desperation but refused to indulge it. From the balcony above, Queen Cersei watched, her posture rigid, lips drawn into a thin, displeased line. Though her presence loomed over the hall, she did not intervene. The weight of Tyrion's authority was undeniable, no matter how much it frustrated her. "Grandfather sent you." Joffrey spat, his voice breaking the murmurs in the hall. "Of all people." "Yes, Your Grace," Tyrion replied, unfazed by the young king's growing irritation. "I suppose he thought it best to have someone here who, let's say, understands the nuances of ruling a kingdom." His tone was biting but masked with just enough civility to avoid outright insult. Joffrey leaned forward, his eyes burning with rage, but Tyrion remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "Your grandfather," Tyrion continued, "believes the time for playing games is over. The Iron Throne does not rest easily in a storm. And right now, we are surrounded by storms on all sides." The reminder of the war, of the very real threats gathering at the kingdom's borders, sobered the mood in the room. The court had grown far too comfortable with the spectacle of Joffrey's weekly theatrics, but Tyrion's presence brought a stark reminder that their enemies were not noble ladies being forced to dance for amusement, they were armies, rebels, and kings laying siege to the realm itself. Roslyn observed the shift with growing interest. Tyrion's arrival could change everything. He wasn't known for kindness or sentimentality, but he was known for his intelligence. Perhaps he could bring balance to the court, curb Joffrey's dangerous impulsivity. She didn't allow herself to hope too much, but she sensed a small flicker of relief. With Tyrion as hand, she might gain an ally, someone who could see through the farce she'd been forced to play with Joffrey. Joffrey, however, was not so easily swayed. "And what will you do?" he challenged, his voice trembling slightly, betraying his youth despite the crown atop his head. "Are you here to give lectures, uncle? Or do you actually plan to do something useful?" Tyrion smiled again, this time with a hint of malice. "Oh, I plan to do something useful, Your Grace. Very useful indeed." He paused for a moment. "Be assured this playing at ruling is over." "Do not mistake me for a child," Uncle Joffrey said, his voice lowering dangerously. "I do not need your help to rule." Tyrion bowed slightly, his head dipped just enough to show respect without losing his own authority. "Of course not, Your Grace. But every king needs his counsel. I am only here to serve you." The tension lingered for a moment longer before Joffrey relented, leaning back in the Iron Throne with a huff, his eyes darting around the room, frustrated by the deference being shown to Tyrion. It was clear to all present that while Joffrey might wear the crown, the power in the room had subtly shifted. Tyrion turned to the court, his voice carrying across the hall. "Let it be known, by order of Lord Tywine Lannister, that I, Tyrion of House Lannister, will henceforth serve as Hand of the King until such time as my father returns. All matters of state will pass through me, effective immediately." With that, the session of court felt as though it had shifted from a stage of entertainment back to the somber duties of ruling. Roslyn sat quietly at Joffrey's side, her face betraying nothing, but inwardly, she felt the tides of power turning. Chapter 19, Roslyn 9. Chapter text. Roslyn 9. Roslyn's wrists burned as Joffrey yanked her out of the great hall, his grip tight and unrelenting. His fingers dug cruelly into her skin, leaving her struggling to keep pace with his furious strides as he dragged her through the shadowed corridors of the Red Keep. The silence between them was suffocating. Joffrey hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the hall, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, and every hurried step felt like a countdown to something worse. Behind them, a member of the King's Guard followed at a distance, his face impassive beneath his helmet. Roslyn knew better than to expect any protection from him. No knight of the King's Guard would intervene on her behalf, not against the king. They were sworn to protect Joffrey, not his victims. The thought chilled her, sending a shiver down her spine as she glanced back briefly, only to see the silent guard watching them, as indifferent as a statue. Her thoughts raced as they neared Joffrey's private chambers. She had seen this side of him before, the tempest of his anger, but never had it been so visceral, so consuming. The scene in the throne room had bruised his fragile ego, and now, Roslyn feared she would be the target of his humiliation. Joffrey burst through the doors, his fury barely contained, his hand still clamped around Roslyn's wrist. With a rough, careless shove, he threw her into the room, causing her to stumble forward as the doors slammed shut behind them. The echo of wood crashing into place seemed to reverberate through the chamber, a final seal that left the Kingsguard on the other side, indifferent and distant. Now, it was just the two of them. Roslyn had been alone with Joffrey before, but never under such a cloud of rage, never with this edge of unpredictability that sent her heart racing in her chest. The air between them was thick with tension, so oppressive it felt as if the walls themselves had drawn closer. She could hear the rush of her own pulse in her ears, drowning out the sound of Joffrey's shallow, labored breathing. There was a moment of unbearable silence. Joffrey's eyes bore into her, seething with unspoken fury, his lips curled in a sneer. Roslyn stood frozen, trying to compose herself, though her mind raced with possibilities of what might come next. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and forced herself to break the silence, her voice trembling but steady. "Your Grace," Roslyn began, her voice trembling just slightly as she tried to regain her composure, her mind racing to find the right words to diffuse Joffrey's anger. Before she could finish, Joffrey whipped around, eyes ablaze. "Don't you dare speak to me like one of them," he snarled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. His face twisted with barely contained rage as he took a step toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think I didn't see it? The way you stood there, letting him make a fool of me in front of my court. In front of you." Roslyn took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm even as fear clawed at her insides. She had always known Joffrey was dangerous, his temper quick to flare, but this was different. The cold, calculating cruelty she'd grown used to was gone, replaced by something far more volatile. "I didn't," she started, but Joffrey cut her off with a sharp, mocking laugh. "You didn't." He stepped closer, looming over her now, his presence suffocating. "You stood there, just like the rest of them, while my uncle humiliated me. And you, the one person who should have defended me, who should have stopped him, you said nothing." His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "Nothing." Roslyn's mind raced as she tried to find the right words, anything that might calm him. "Your Grace, Tyrion's words mean nothing," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He may hold the title of hand, but you are the king. You're the one who holds the power, not him." Joffrey's eyes narrowed, studying her, and for a moment, she thought she might have gotten through to him. But then he scoffed, shaking his head. "Do you think I'm stupid?" His voice cracked with frustration. "I know what they are saying behind my back, what they think of me. They don't fear me the way they feared my father. They mock me." Roslyn took a hesitant step forward, lifting her hand to gently touch his face, but before she could, Joffrey slapped it away with a sharp, angry snarl. "You'll never touch me like that again, not unless I say so," he spat, his face inches from hers now. His breath was hot against her skin, his eyes filled with a dangerous mixture of anger and something darker. "You think because you're his wife, that you're safe. But you're not, Roslyn. You belong to me now." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Roslyn's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been playing a dangerous game, and now, it felt as if the pieces were slipping out of her control. Joffrey had always been cruel, always unpredictable, but this was different. His obsession had grown, twisted into something far more dangerous. "Please, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice careful, pleading, as if she were trying to soothe a wild animal. "I only want to serve you, to be of aid in any way I can. But you must know, I am loyal to you." Joffrey's sneer softened, just barely, but his eyes remained hard. He reached out suddenly, his hand gripping her chin, tilting her head up so that she was forced to look directly into his cold, unfeeling gaze. "Loyal," he repeated, his voice a dangerous purr. "Then prove it." Her heart skipped a beat, fear tightening her chest. How? His smile returned, slow and menacing, as he took a step closer to her. You know, he began, his voice dripping with an unsettling calmness, I realized something today at court. His eyes gleamed with twisted amusement. When I was talking to the red wine girl, it finally struck me why you're so fascinating to me. He reached out and gently twirled a strand of her hair between his fingers, his touch a dangerous contrast to the tension building in the room. Other girls are dull, predictable, eager to say what they think I want to hear, desperate to please. But you don't play their game, do you, Roslyn? Roslyn's heart quickened as she forced a smile, hoping to keep his temper at bay. Of course not, Your Grace, she replied carefully, her voice steady though her nerves frayed. We're friends. Why would I need to pretend with you? She took a slow step back and then gracefully sat by the window, creating a safe distance between them. Every movement was calculated, calm but deliberate. Something was different about him. His demeanor was darker, his gaze more predatory, like a cat stalking its prey. But Joffrey wasn't fooled by her attempt to deflect. His smile widened, his gaze unblinking as he followed her retreat. Friends? No, Roslyn, we're not friends, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. My father used to tell me I was strange, because by the time I reached 4 and 10, I still showed no interest in girls. And he was right. I had no interest. He came to stand beside her at the window, though his eyes remained fixed on the city below, not on her. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, thick with menace. I never understood it, Joffrey murmured, his voice soft but chilling, as though he was sharing some private revelation. Why the idea of sex seemed to rule everyone. My father was obsessed with it, always boasting, always indulging. His lips twisted in disdain. It baffled me. It disgusted me, really. And then I met you, Roslyn. Roslyn's blood ran cold, her entire body stiffening as his words settled over her like a noose tightening around her neck. She could feel where this was leading, the unspoken threat laced in every syllable. A primal instinct screamed at her to run, to put as much distance as she could between herself and Joffrey. But her legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted her to the spot, as if her body had betrayed her mind's most desperate command. It wasn't just that she knew she shouldn't run, there were guards outside, no escape, no sanctuary, it was that she physically couldn't. She was frozen, paralyzed by the aura of cruelty that emanated from him. Joffrey turned his head slightly, his eyes dark and gleaming with a dangerous intensity as he studied her, as though she were some fascinating creature caught in his web. It's all I can think about, touching you. Kissing you. Fucking you. You're not like the others, he continued, stepping closer. You're not afraid to challenge me, not afraid to play your own game. He gave a low, almost amused chuckle. And I think that's why I finally understand, why I want you so badly. You want me too. He leaned in slightly, his breath hot against her skin, and Roslyn could feel the tension building in the room. Her heart pounded in her chest, so loud she wondered if he could hear it. She felt the urge to scream, to fight, but she knew it would be futile. Here, in this room, in this castle, she was his prisoner in all but name. Joffrey's fingers slid along her jaw, a touch that was soft yet filled with menace, like a predator toying with its prey. His thumb brushed against her chin, tilting her face up until their eyes locked, trapping her in his gaze. Roslyn felt her pulse quicken, the air around them thick with an unspoken threat. She could feel the raw power he held over her, every ounce of his authority pressing down on her like a suffocating weight. He leaned closer, so close she could feel the heat of his breath. His lips barely grazed hers as he whispered, his voice low and dangerous, "Get on the bed." The words sent a jolt of terror through her, but she couldn't move, her body refusing to obey even as her mind screamed for her to run, to fight. Her stomach churned, and she fought back the bile rising in her throat. This wasn't a command, it was a statement of control, a reminder that no matter how carefully she had played her part in this twisted game, it was his game all along. Her mouth went dry, but she forced herself to speak, her voice trembling. "Your Grace," she began, trying to find some shred of her composure, some fragment of the mask she had worn for so long, but the words faltered under the intensity of his stare. Roslyn's heart hammered in her chest, but still she remained frozen, her feet rooted to the ground. Every fiber of her being resisted, but she knew, deep down, there was no one here to protect her. No one to stop him. The king's guard outside wouldn't dare defy him. Even if they heard her scream, they wouldn't intervene. Not against the king. With a shaky breath, Rosalind swallowed her pride, her honor, and the last pieces of her resistance. Slowly, she took a step back, her feet moving as though they belonged to someone else, her body numb. Her hands fumbled with the fabric of her gown as she turned toward the bed, each movement feeling like a slow march toward her doom. She could feel Joffrey's eyes on her, drinking in every second of her humiliation. "I think about you every night," Rosalind Joffrey murmured, his voice laced with dark desire as she reluctantly laid back on the bed. He stood over her, eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction as he began to unfasten his doublet, his movements slow, deliberate. "How much you want me," he continued, his tone twisted with a sick sense of triumph. Rosalind's body tensed as he spoke, her mind racing, desperately trying to block out his words. "Every night, after you leave," he went on, his voice soft, but dripping with malice, "I think about you lying underneath him as he fucks you. Wishing it was me. Wishing you were in my bed instead of his." His smile grew wider, more venomous, as if the thought brought him some perverse pleasure. As Joffrey advanced, Rosalind's mind was flooded with thoughts of Robb, his warmth, his strength, the promise of their life together. She could do this, she thought, she could survive. Just as her heart began to race with fear, a sudden voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The doors to the king's chambers burst open, revealing Tyrion Lannister standing in the threshold, his expression a mixture of disbelief and indignation. The air seemed to shift as Rosalind sat up, a mix of hope and anxiety washing over her. Tyrion's presence filled the room with an unexpected sense of authority, his stance firm and resolute. "Are you an idiot?" he continued, eyes narrowing. "All of the women in the kingdom, and you go after the wife of one of your greatest allies." Rosalind's breath hitched, relief mingling with apprehension. She dared to glance at Joffrey, whose face twisted with rage, the flush of anger contrasting sharply with his previous demeanor. As Joffrey glared at Tyrion, the tension in the room crackled like a storm about to break. "This is none of your business, uncle," he spat, fists clenching at his sides. His eyes darted between his uncle and Rosalind, fury radiating off him in palpable waves. "On the contrary, it is very much my business," Tyrion shot back, his tone steady and unyielding. He stepped further into the chamber, making his way toward Joffrey with a calmness that only seemed to infuriate the young king more. "Your actions reflect on the crown, and this kind of behavior is unacceptable. You're to be a king, not a petulant child. And instead you decide that you're going to parade around one of the most powerful men in the kingdom's wife as if she was your whore. Are you determined to make Robb Stark a cuckold? Is that it, boy? Your grand plan to turn your allies against you?" Rosalind took the opportunity to inch back, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Joffrey's glare burning into her, a mixture of possessiveness and contempt. "You think you can just barge in here and lecture me?" Joffrey sneered, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice, a flicker of doubt as he faced his uncle. "Yes," Tyrion replied bluntly, undeterred. "Because someone has to remind you that being king does not grant you the right to act like a brute. You may hold the power, but you will not wield it over others without consequence." He gestured toward Rosalind, his voice softening. "She is not a toy for you to play with. You need to remember that." Rosalind's heart swelled with gratitude as Tyrion defended her, but she also sensed Joffrey's simmering rage. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she feared he might lash out at his uncle instead. "You think you can speak to me like that?" Joffrey seethed, his voice barely containing his anger. "Someone must," Tyrion replied, folding his arms across his chest with a firmness that belied his stature. "Before you destroy everything that better men than you have worked for. Before you ruin your own reputation further. You have a girl waiting to be your bride, and yet you choose to humiliate her by pursuing her brother's wife like a common fool. Do you even understand the consequences of your actions?" Joffrey's sneer deepened, a flicker of defiance igniting in his eyes. "If I want her, I'll have her," he retorted, his voice dripping with entitlement. "I'm the king." Tyrion stepped closer, his gaze steady and piercing. "You may wear the crown, but true power comes from respect, not fear, and I promise you, boy, not a single lord in this country respects you." Joffrey waved a dismissive hand, but Tyrion pressed on, his voice lowering but growing more intense. You see only what is in front of you, but you fail to grasp the larger picture. Every act of cruelty you inflict on those around you will ripple outward. This is not a game, Joffrey. This is politics, and there are stakes far greater than your childish whims. Roslyn, feeling the weight of the confrontation, remained silent but attentive, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the tension building in Joffrey, his pride battling against the undeniable logic of Tyrion's words. I love her. Joffrey screamed, his voice echoing off the stone walls, a raw mixture of defiance and desperation. You know nothing of love. Tyrion shouted back, matching his anger with a fierce intensity. You are incapable of love. What you feel is obsession. You are blinded by your desire, mistaking lust for something far deeper. Love does not possess, it cherishes. It does not conquer, it uplifts. And besides, she does not love you, you are unlovable. Joffrey's face contorted with frustration, the conflict within him palpable. He glanced at Roslyn, then back at Tyrion, as if seeking validation for his feelings. But deep down, he sensed the truth of Tyrion's words. The atmosphere in the room was charged, and Roslyn could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on them. Get out, Joffrey finally muttered, the bravado in his voice wavering, his anger giving way to a fragile insecurity. Both of you, leave me. Come, my lady, Tyrion said, extending a hand to Roslyn, his tone gentle yet firm. I'll escort you to your rooms. Roslyn hesitated, torn between the turmoil of the moment and the palpable tension in Joffrey's gaze. She could feel the storm within him, a whirlwind of emotions battling for dominance. But the thought of remaining in that room, facing his wrath alone, filled her with dread. She took Tyrion's hand, grateful for his presence. As they stepped into the corridor, the weight of the encounter began to lift, yet the uncertainty of what lay ahead lingered. Tyrion guided her with a measured pace, his expression thoughtful. Are you all right, Lady Roslyn? He asked, concern etched into his features. I'm fine, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. I swear, my lord, I wouldn't, share his bed, I mean. Tyrion nodded, his brow furrowing as he absorbed her words. I know, my lady. I'm sorry you've faced him alone for so long. But I promise you, you will never be left alone with him again. As they reached her door, Roslyn turned to him, gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you for intervening. I don't know what might have happened if you hadn't come in when you did. Unfortunately, my lady, I do know what would have happened, Tyrion replied, a flicker of seriousness crossing his features. And I also know what your husband would do to me if he thought I allowed it. A small smile touched his lips, lightening the gravity of the moment. I met him in Winterfell, you know. He's strong, your husband. As are you, Lady Stark. Roslyn felt a swell of pride at his words. Robb is strong, yes, but he's far away, further by the day, I fear. Tyrion's expression softened. The Stark name you have carries significant weight, even within these walls. You must remember that, Roslyn. For those of us who don't wield swords, the alliances we forge can be just as powerful. She sighed, glancing down the hallway as if expecting more chaos to emerge from the shadows. I worry about what Joffrey is becoming, what he might do next. If he sees me as a threat or a toy, then he will be the fool, Tyrion said firmly. Joffrey may wear the crown, but it doesn't grant him wisdom. You have allies, both in and outside these walls. Use them. Roslyn nodded, feeling a sense of resolve growing within her. I will. But I fear for those who don't have the strength to protect themselves. Tyrion's eyes softened. That's the heart of a true leader, my lady. It's what will set you apart in this game. He hesitated for a moment, then continued, if you ever feel cornered or in danger, seek me out. I may not have the might of a warrior, but I know how to navigate these treacherous waters. Thank you, Tyrion, she replied sincerely. Your support means more than you know. With a final nod, he stepped back, preparing to leave. Stay safe, Roslyn. And remember, not all battles are fought with swords. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is your own mind. As he walked away, she closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment. The quiet of her chambers felt both comforting and isolating. The weight of the day's events settled over her like a thick fog, and she took a deep breath, reminding herself of the strength within her. She moved to her window, gazing out at the sprawling city below, where lights flickered like distant stars against the darkening sky. The streets were alive with activity, yet the castle felt like a prison, its walls closing in around her. Tomorrow, she would begin anew, fortified by the knowledge that she was not alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could turn the tide in her favor before it was too late. Chapter 20, Rob 8. Chapter text. Rob 8. As Rob approached the outskirts of Bitterbridge, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. The journey from Harrenhal had taken nearly 10 days of relentless hard riding, the unforgiving pace pressing on his every nerve and muscle. But it wasn't just the physical toll of this road that wore him down. It had been almost 3 moons since his father's arrest and the beginning of his campaign, and in all that time, Rob had barely paused for breath. The longest reprieve he had known was the brief time spent in King's Landing, a handful of days that had done little to ease his fatigue. If anything, the political intrigue and constant maneuvering had left him more strained than before. There, he had been surrounded by enemies disguised as allies, every conversation a delicate dance, every glance a potential threat. The tension of his stay in the capital had been suffocating, offering no peace, no solace. Sleep had eluded him since the day he left Winterfell. Each night was a battle against his own mind, his thoughts too restless to allow him peace. But in recent weeks, rest had become even more elusive. Some nights he managed only an hour or two, fitful and broken. The absence of Roslyn by his side only deepened his insomnia. Without her warmth, her steady presence, his bed felt cold, unfamiliar. He hadn't realized just how much comfort he had drawn from her until it was gone, leaving him alone with the weight of his worries. The road from Harrenhal to Bitterbridge had been a ceaseless blur of muddy tracks, cold nights, and bitter winds. The handful of men who were journeying with him were loyal but weary, and Rob could see the same fatigue in their eyes, the same longing for a moment of respite. Yet rest was a luxury none of them could afford. The war pressed on, and with Renly Baratheon's camp now so close, Rob knew that Bitterbridge would offer no sanctuary, only more negotiations, more deception, and the looming threat of betrayal. Rob and his men arrived at Renly's camp as the sky blushed with the fading light of dusk. The sprawling encampment stretched before them like a vast, vivid tapestry, a stark contrast to the grim northern camps Rob was used to. Instead of the rugged simplicity of the north, Renly's army seemed to revel in extravagance. Tents of deep purples and rich blues dominated the landscape, their vibrant colors standing out against the twilight, each one more lavish than the last. As nightfall deepened, the camp came alive with the flickering glow of countless torches, casting an almost magical light across the scene. It felt less like the heart of a military campaign and more like a grand festival. Voices and laughter echoed through the air, and the scent of roasting meats wafted on the evening breeze. Music played in the distance, the cheerful strumming of lutes and drums a strange accompaniment to a war camp. Rob couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Beneath the facade of celebration, this was still a place of war. Yet Renly's camp seemed to ignore the brutal reality awaiting them all, as if believing themselves invincible through sheer display of wealth and power. His men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly as unsettled as he was by the almost surreal atmosphere. Rob had prepared himself for a hard, strategic meeting with an enemy, but this was something entirely different. The Stark in him bristled at the extravagance, a reminder of just how different the Southern Lords were. Yet, somewhere deep down, a flicker of admiration stirred. This was a king who understood the power of spectacle, of appearances, in a way Rob could never have conceived. For a brief moment, as he surveyed the scene, Rob allowed himself to wonder what kind of man Renly Baratheon truly was. A conqueror? A pretender? Or merely a dreamer, caught up in a game far bigger than himself? As Rob and his men ventured deeper into Renly's camp, the sounds of merriment grew louder. Men dressed in fine silks and embroidered tunics walked through the pathways, some laughing heartily with tankards in hand, others engaged in quiet conversations under the torchlight. Rob's eyes scanned the unfamiliar faces, many of whom looked at him and his northern entourage with a mixture of curiosity and respect, though some held a hint of disdain for the rougher, more practical northern appearance. One of Renly's guards, a tall man in gleaming armor emblazoned with the golden stag of House Baratheon, approached, bowing his head slightly in greeting. Lord Stark, the man said, his voice formal, we've been expecting you. King Renly is eager to receive you in his pavilion. Robb nodded, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. He had ridden hard for days, and part of him wished for nothing more than to rest. But there was no time for that. The guard led Robb and his closest bannermen through the camp, passing more soldiers and banners, all carrying the unmistakable sigil of House Baratheon. The richness of the camp's decorations continued to unsettle him, the luxury a strange juxtaposition to the harsh reality of war. Finally, they reached Renly's pavilion, a massive structure, its fabric a deep royal blue, fluttering softly in the evening breeze. The entrance was flanked by 2 knights of Renly's Rainbow Guard, their cloaks as brilliantly colored as the tent itself. King Renly awaits inside, the guard announced, stepping aside to allow Robb and his men entry. Robb squared his shoulders and exchanged a glance with his bannerman before stepping through the opening. Inside, the pavilion was just as grand as the exterior. Rich carpets lined the ground, and tapestries depicting the great houses of the realm hung from the walls. A long table sat at the center, laden with food and drink, though no one was partaking just yet. At the far end of the pavilion stood Renly Baratheon, resplendent in regal attire more suited for a ball than a battlefield. His armor gleamed under the soft glow of lanterns, polished to a sheen that spoke more of showmanship than utility. Beside him stood a striking young woman, draped in a flowing gown of rich green and gold, her beauty undeniable. An intricately crafted crown rested upon her head, the delicate jewels catching the light. "Ah, the young wolf!" Renly exclaimed as he approached, his arms open wide in greeting. He wore an easy smile, his face warm and welcoming, though Robb could not tell if the warmth was genuine or merely part of the man's charm. "We meet at last. I must say, I've heard much of you." Robb inclined his head politely but did not return the smile. "King Renly," he replied, keeping his tone measured. "You have built quite a camp here. One might mistake it for a feast, not a war council." Renly let out a chuckle, the sound light and airy, echoing through the opulent tent as though it carried no weight of war. "A feast," he repeated, his lips curling into a playful smile. "Why not? War, after all, is such a dreary affair, don't you think?" His eyes glinted with amusement, as if the brutal reality of the conflict surrounding them was little more than a passing inconvenience. "I've always believed that men fight best when reminded of what they are fighting for. And if that happens to be wine, women, and song, then who am I to deny them their pleasures?" There was a careless grace to his words, a nonchalance that made the entire scene feel more like an extravagant gathering than the staging ground of a king's army. To Renly, this was a game, one he was determined to win, but a game nonetheless. He turned, his hand gesturing toward the striking figure by his side. "May I introduce my wife, Queen Margaery," he said with a flourish. At his introduction, Margaery stepped forward with an elegance that matched the finery of her gown. She offered a warm, inviting smile, one that seemed designed to put anyone at ease, yet Robb couldn't help but notice the sharp intelligence behind her gaze. "Lord Stark," she greeted him, her voice soft yet confident, "it's an honor to finally meet you." Her eyes lingered on Robb for a moment, her expression one of genuine interest. "I trust you will find our camp hospitable, even if our methods are somewhat unorthodox." Renly's arm rested casually on her shoulder, his demeanor as relaxed as ever. "You see," Robb Renly continued with an amused smirk, "my queen here understands well the importance of keeping morale high. After all, a king's duty is not only to lead but to inspire." He glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping across the lively gathering of lords and knights. "Let them drink, let them laugh, so long as they fight when the time comes." Robb's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. "And what do you fight for, King Renly?" he asked, his gaze steady. "What is it that drives you to claim the Iron Throne?" Renly's smile softened, and for a moment, his eyes grew serious. "What do I fight for? Justice, perhaps. A better future for the realm. Or maybe, I fight because I believe I can be the king this realm deserves, a king of peace, not war." He gestured around him. "Look at them, Robb. My men. They follow me not because I am the oldest or the strongest, but because they believe in me. They believe I will bring something better than the chaos that is tearing Westeros apart." Robb considered Renly's words carefully, though he could not shake the feeling that the man's vision was clouded by Nived. A king of peace. In a time like this. Still, there was no denying that Renly had a charm that could sway hearts, and perhaps even win battles before swords were drawn. Before Robb could respond, Renly clapped his hands together, breaking the tension. But enough talk of heavy matters. You must be famished after your long ride. Come, eat, drink. There will be plenty of time for politics later. Robb hesitated. He had no desire to indulge in Renly's lavish hospitality, not when so much was at stake. But he knew he needed to play the game, to understand Renly better before making any decisions. He glanced at his bannerman, who looked equally wary, then nodded. Very well, Robb said, moving toward the table. But know that I did not come here for feasts or songs. I came for answers, and I hope you're ready to give them. Renly smiled again, though this time there was a flicker of something else behind his eyes, something calculating. Oh, I assure you, Robb Stark, he said, lifting a goblet of wine, you'll have all the answers you seek. As the two kings sat across from one another, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows over their faces, Robb couldn't help but wonder if Renly's easy confidence masked something more dangerous, something that, despite the laughter and feasts, would soon reveal itself. As the night wore on, Robb found himself observing more than partaking in the revelry around him. The grand tent was filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking goblets, and the hum of conversation, all underscored by the flickering light of torches casting shadows across the faces of Renly's gathered lords and knights. Despite the weariness of his journey, Robb couldn't help but be drawn into the spectacle unfolding before him, though not by the revelry itself, but by Renly Baratheon and his queen. Renly moved through the gathering with ease, his charisma almost effortless. He laughed with his lords, slapped their backs in camaraderie, and drank with them as if they were old friends rather than men bound to him by oaths. He told stories of his childhood at Storm's End, his voice booming with laughter as he recounted playful tales of his older brother, Robert, and shared jests made at the expense of their brother, Stannis. Though some of the tales seemed far-fetched, impossible to be true, no one questioned them. They were swept along in the charm of it all, as if Renly's very presence turned war into a distant memory, something they could afford to forget, even if just for a night. But it wasn't just Renly that held the room. Margaery Tyrell, seated beside her king with the grace of a queen born to the role, was equally mesmerizing. Robb listened as she spoke with quiet authority about her work in the Reach, her efforts to care for the small folk, and the initiatives she hoped to continue once they reached King's Landing. There was a sincerity in her voice that Robb couldn't deny, though he wasn't sure if it was meant for the lords or for Renly. She painted a picture of a queen who wasn't just ornamental, but one who would serve her people, a partner to the king in both governance and heart. What struck Robb most was how the two of them, Renly and Margaery, fit so perfectly together. Throughout the night, Margaery's gaze rarely left Renly, her eyes full of admiration and warmth. She hung on his every word, laughed at his jokes, and even when she wasn't speaking, her presence was undeniable, a queen who seemed to embody the very ideal of love and loyalty. Renly, in turn, was rarely without physical contact with her. His hand rested casually on her thigh, his thumb occasionally brushing the fabric of her gown, a gesture so intimate yet so natural it was easy to forget they weren't alone. They acted as if they had stepped from the pages of one of Sang's beloved storybooks, the perfect king and queen united not just by power but by love. Yet, Robb couldn't shake the feeling that much of what he was witnessing was as much for show as it was genuine. Was Margaery's adoration of Renly real, or was it the well-rehearsed performance of a woman raised to be queen? And Renly, was his devotion to Margaery a reflection of true affection, or part of a carefully constructed image to win the loyalty of his lords? Robb wasn't sure, but the ease with which they carried themselves suggested that even if it was all an act, it was one they had perfected. The lords around them clearly bought into the image. Renly was beloved, there was no question about that. They hung on his every word, laughing at his jests, toasting his health, and speaking of him with admiration when he wasn't listening. It was clear that they followed him not just because of his claim to the throne, but because they wanted to follow him. Renly had made them believe in him, in his vision of a brighter future where war was only a temporary distraction, and the real joy in life lay in feasts, laughter, and the promise of peace to come. Robb felt a pang of doubt as he compared his own camp to Renly's. His men followed him, but it was out of necessity, loyalty to House Stark, and the deep, simmering rage they all carried for the wrongs done to their families. There was no laughter in Rob's camp, no songs or grand speeches of peace. His men were hardened by the North and by the war. They fought because they had to, not because they believed in the man leading them. As the night went on, Rob found himself wondering, was that better? Was it easier to fight when you had something more to fight for than vengeance and survival? Could men fight for a dream as easily as they could for duty? The festivities continued, but Rob's mind remained elsewhere. He watched Renly and Margaery, wondering just how